Hey guys, tonight we're stepping back in time, not to the grand battlefields or the famous conquests, but to the kitchens and mess halls of the ancient world. You're going to join me on a journey through the menu of Alexander the Great. Imagine yourself there, a fly on the wall, or maybe a mosquito, feasting on a less than five-star meal alongside a Macedonian soldier in the blistering heat of Persia. We'll be exploring what fueled the man who conquered the known world, and what sustained the men who followed him. Now, a heads up. This isn't a thrilling tale of heroism and clashing swords. This is the history of ancient food, so there's a good chance you won't survive this without a yawn or two. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. Let me know where you're listening from and what time it is for you in the comments below. Now, dim the lights. Maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum. And let's ease into tonight's journey together. Picture this. You're standing in a grand, sun-drenched hall in Pella, the capital of ancient Macedon. The year is 336 BC, and the air is thick with the scent of roasting meat and the murmur of anticipation. This isn't just any dinner, it's a royal banquet, a lavish send-off for a prince about to embark on the journey of a lifetime. The walls are draped with rich textiles, and the floor is a mosaic of intricate patterns. You, a guest of sorts, recline on a sort of couch bed, your elbow propped up as you watch the spectacle unfold. This is your first glimpse into the world of Alexander the Great, and it begins not with a battle plan, but with a platter. Before you, the table is a mosaic of different foods. A roasted pig, glazed with honey and herbs, is the centerpiece. This is your mainstream historical fact for the night. Roasted boar or pig was a common and prized dish at ancient Macedonian banquets, a symbol of both wealth and successful hunting. Flanking it are platters piled high with vegetables, cucumbers, leeks, and onions, alongside various kinds of flatbread, some of it still warm from the oven. You notice servants gliding silently between the couches, their hands full of clay amphorae, pouring dark, rich wine into shallow bowls. But look closer. You see something odd. A serving dish is filled with what looks like small, reddish-brown pellets. Your quirky fact for the night: this is likely a form of a very ancient, pre-modern hummus, or something similar. While the chickpeas and lentils were a staple for the common folk, they were prepared with a twist for the elite, ground into a paste with olive oil and seasoned with wild herbs. It's a humble food elevated to a dish for kings, a culinary foreshadowing of Alexander's later ability to blend different cultures. As the night progresses, the conversation turns to politics and military strategy, but your focus stays on the food. You watch as Alexander, seated at the head table, is served a small, simple portion of meat and vegetables. His father, King Philip II, is much more gluttonous, laughing loudly as he reaches for more food. Historians still argue whether Alexander's relatively Spartan eating habits were a deliberate contrast to his father's excesses or simply a natural disinterest in food. Some say it was a form of self-discipline, a way to show his men he was no different from them in his simple needs, even as he held the highest office. The whole scene is a sensory paradox. The air is warm and filled with rich smells, but the atmosphere is charged with a quiet tension, the anticipation of war. You watch as a servant offers you a small, dried fig, a touch of sweetness to cut through the richness of the meal. The fig is shriveled, yet surprisingly flavorful. A tiny, unassuming bit of history in your hand. You pop it into your mouth, and, as the sweetness spreads, you get a sense of just how important food was. Not just as fuel, but as a marker of social status, a tool for diplomacy, and a way to celebrate victory. This one meal in Pella is a microcosm of the entire empire to come. As the royal banquet fades into a hazy memory, you find yourself trudging along a dusty, sun-scorched road. The silks and fine wines of Pella are gone, replaced by the reality of military life. You are no longer an observer in a hall of kings, but a common soldier in Alexander's army, a part of a vast marching machine. The air, once thick with the scent of roasted pig, now smells of sweat, dust, and leather. Your stomach rumbles, A constant companion on this long journey. This is the diet of the foot soldier, a world away from the banquet hall. The bulk of your sustenance comes from a ration bag slung over your shoulder. This is the cornerstone of the soldier's diet, and it's about as exciting as watching paint dry. Your mainstream fact for this section is simple but profound. The Roman army famously marched on a diet of grain, but long before them. Alexander's army did the same. The basic ration was a measure of grain, often barley, sometimes wheat. This wasn't a pre-packaged MRE. It was raw grain that you, or someone in your squad, had to turn into food. You might receive it whole, or perhaps as a coarse flour. The flour would then be mixed with water to form a simple dough, and then baked on a hot stone or over a small fire into a hard, unleavened bread or biscuit. It was dry, it was bland, and it was absolutely essential. For a bit of variety, your quirky fact for the night is that soldiers would often mix their grain with whatever they could find or forage. This could include wild herbs, crushed legumes, or even a bit of fat from a slaughtered animal. But when times were lean, they would grind the barley into a paste and eat it raw, just to get the calories in. It was a gritty, unappetizing slurry. But it kept you going. This simple act of survival highlights the ingenuity born from necessity. No fancy sauces, no roasted boar, just the bare essentials to keep a man standing on his feet, day after blistering day. As you march, you listen to the chatter around you. There's a debate among the men. Some argue that the commanders should have prioritized more meat in the rations. Others contend that the grain-heavy diet was more practical and easier to carry. This is our scholarly debate for the night. Historians still argue whether the logistical superiority of grain-based rations was a deliberate strategic choice or simply a reflection of what was most readily available to feed a massive force on the move. Was it a calculated decision to ensure supply lines didn't break down, or just the best they could do with the technology and resources of the time? The answer probably lies somewhere in the middle, beyond the rations. A soldier's diet was supplemented by what could be acquired. Foraging was a daily task. You'd be on the lookout for wild onions, leeks, or any edible plant you could recognize. If you were lucky, you might come across a small stream where you could catch a fish, or if you were really, really lucky, a hunting party might bring down a wild goat. But these were luxuries, not guaranteed parts of the daily menu. The core was always the grain. It was the constant, the unyielding foundation of your existence. It was what gave you the energy to carry your shield, to wield your spear, and to keep up with the relentless pace set by a king who seemed to need no rest. You reach the end of the day. Exhausted, your feet aching, you find a patch of ground and sit with your companions. Someone has managed to get a small fire going. You mix your coarse barley flour with a little water from your water skin, patting it into a crude circle. As you place it on a hot stone next to the flames, a familiar, bready smell fills the air. It's not the aroma of a five-star kitchen, but it's the smell of survival. You might joke with your friend about trading a bit of your barley for some of his, well, you don't even know what that green paste is, but you laugh. Because at the end of the day, a full belly, no matter how blandly filled, is its own kind of victory. The hard bread is the food of conquerors. A symbol of resilience and a simple truth: you are what you eat, and what you eat is what keeps you going. Your hands, once clean from the royal feast, are now calloused and stained with the grit of travel. You've gotten used to the taste of dust and the rhythmic creak of the supply wagons. Your mind, which once processed the grand pronouncements of a king, now focuses on one simple, mundane question: how do you make this barley edible? This is the story of the unsung hero of the ancient world's military diet: grain. It wasn't just food, it was currency, fuel, and the silent anchor of every campaign. Your mainstream historical fact for the night is that barley, more than any other grain, was the staple of the ancient Greek and Macedonian diet, especially for the common person. It was a rugged grain, able to grow in harsher conditions than wheat, and it provided a reliable, dense source of carbohydrates for you, the soldier. It meant a constant supply of energy for those long, grueling marches. You'd receive it in your rations, sometimes whole, sometimes already ground into a coarse flour called alfita. It was your daily bread. Literally and figuratively, you'd chew on it, you'd cook it, you'd even try to trade it for something else, but you always knew you could count on it. Now for a quirky tidbit. There's a story told among the men that a soldier once tried to bake a loaf of bread in a hot spring they found. He mixed the barley flour with some water, buried it in the mud next to the spring, and let the heat do the work. The result was a bizarre, almost gelatinous lump that no one wanted to touch. But the story stuck around, a testament to the endless, often humorous, attempts to make the boring grain more interesting. It's a reminder that even in the midst of a grand military campaign, the most persistent struggle was often with the simplest things, like dinner. As you sit by a small fire, gnawing on a hard biscuit, you overhear a debate among some of the older soldiers. "It's all about the wheat," one man insists. "It makes a better flour, a softer bread." "Nonsense," another retorts. "The barley sticks to your ribs. It's what keeps us going on an empty stomach." This is your scholarly debate moment. Historians still argue whether the prevalence of barley over wheat was purely a matter of practical logistics, barley was more resilient and cheaper, or if there was a cultural preference for it among the Macedonians and Greeks of that time, perhaps it was a bit of both. The simple fact remains that, for Alexander's army, the journey of conquest was powered by this unglamorous grain. The flour itself was often a far cry from the fine, bleached white flour we know today. It was coarse, often still containing bits of the hull, and had a slightly nutty, sometimes bitter taste. When you mixed it with water and a bit of salt, it became a thick, sticky dough that you'd bake on a hot stone or in a small clay oven. The resulting flatbread, or maza, was tough and dense. You'd break it off in chunks and dip it in whatever you had, a little olive oil, some wine, or maybe just a bit of water to soften it. It wasn't a gourmet experience, but every bite was a deposit of energy for the day to come. You might even see a group of soldiers gathered around, using a small, handheld millstone to grind their rations. The repetitive, hypnotic scraping sound becomes a part of the background noise of the camp. It's a slow, steady process that mirrors the slow, steady march of the army itself. The grain is a perfect metaphor for the campaign. It's not glamorous. It's a lot of work. And it's absolutely necessary. You close your eyes, the warmth of the fire on your face, the simple taste of barley in your mouth, and you feel the immense weight of history resting on this one humble food. Having ground and baked your barley into a hard, dense flatbread, you now face the next culinary challenge of military life, making it palatable. Your ration pouch, besides the inevitable grain, contains another essential item that serves as both food and medicine. This is where your journey into the world of ancient cooking gets a little less dry. Literally. The substance in question is the liquid gold of the ancient Mediterranean, olive oil. Your mainstream historical fact for this section is that olive oil was an absolutely essential part of the ancient Greek and Macedonian diet. It wasn't just for cooking, it was used for light, for religious rituals, for medicine, and for cleansing the body, for the soldiers. It was a caloric powerhouse. A little bit of olive oil drizzled on your hard barley bread could transform a driedy, unappealing meal into something that felt nourishing and satisfying. It provided much-needed fat and energy, crucial for a life of constant physical exertion. You'd pour it from a small and squat clay flask. Its rich, fruity smell a brief but welcome relief from the pervasive dust and sweat. And here's your quirky tidbit. The olive oil a soldier carried was not the crystal clear, refined stuff you find in a supermarket today. It was likely a thick, green, and often cloudy concoction, sometimes with a slightly bitter aftertaste. Ancient methods of pressing olives weren't always focused on purity. The goal was to extract as much oil as possible. The oil might even contain small bits of olive pulp or residue. This raw, unfiltered quality gave it a much more robust flavour, but also made it prone to going rancid if not stored properly. A soldier might joke that you could tell how far you were from home by the taste of your oil. The older and more pungent it got, the further you had travelled. The scholarly debate for this section is a good one to chew on while you dip your bread. Historians still argue whether the widespread use of olive oil by the army was a logistical masterpiece or a happy accident. Was it a deliberate choice by Alexander's supply officers to provision the army with a high-calorie, multi-purpose staple? Or was it simply the most common and available cooking fat in the region they were conquering? It's a classic chicken or the egg scenario. Did they bring it because it was the best, or was it the best because it was what they had? The truth is probably that its utility made it the ideal choice, and its abundance made that choice possible. Beyond its role as a dip for bread, olive oil was a versatile ingredient. You might see a small group of soldiers boiling a handful of wild onions or leeks in a tiny pot, and they would add a healthy splash of olive oil to the mix. It was also used to fry things, though without the deep frying technology of today, it was more of a shallow sizzle. For a soldier, a few sips of oil straight from the flask could be a quick burst of energy when there was no time to stop and eat. It was a liquid ration, a portable calorie bomb that kept you from collapsing on the march. You hold your small clay flask in your hand. Its smooth, cool surface feels good against your calloused palm. You unscrew the top and let the strong, earthy aroma waft up. The oil pours out slowly, a thick, viscous stream. You drizzle it onto your dry, hard bread, and watch as it soaks in, transforming the bland cracker into a slightly more appealing meal. The oil leaves a slick film on your fingers, a constant reminder of the simple, but powerful, foods that are fueling this incredible journey. You take a bite, and for a moment, you're not a soldier on a long, hot road. You're a man with a piece of good bread, a drop of liquid gold, and a full stomach. And that, in itself, is a small victory. Your palate, once accustomed to the simple, almost austere flavor of barley and olive oil, now begins to crave something more. You're a long way from home, and the daily grind of marching, sleeping on hard ground, and the constant threat of battle wears on you. Thankfully, your rations, while basic, often included another crucial component that provided both protein and a welcome change in texture. This is the story of pulses, the unsung heroes of ancient nutrition. Your mainstream historical fact for this section is that legumes, lentils, chickpeas, and beans were a vital part of the ancient diet, providing essential protein and fiber for you, the soldier. They were a godsend. They were cheap, easy to store for long periods, and incredibly nutrient-dense. You might receive a small sack of dried lentils or chickpeas in your rations, a small but powerful antidote to the endless monotony of barley bread. You'd soak them in water overnight, then boil them in a pot with whatever else you could find, a little salt, some wild herbs, and a splash of olive oil, and you had a hearty stew that felt like a feast after days of dry rations. Now for a quirky tidbit. There's a belief, one that you've heard whispered among the men, that eating a certain kind of pulse, specifically a type of broad bean, could bring good luck. It was a superstition born from the simple fact that a good meal could lift spirits and make you feel invincible. The beans themselves were considered sacred in some ancient cults and were even forbidden to some priests. But for a soldier, they were simply a welcome addition to the pot. It's a small, human touch in the midst of a grand military machine, a tiny piece of ritual in a life of endless routine. As you share a bowl of lentil stew with your companions, you listen to a heated discussion. The lentils fill you up. Yes, one soldier says, but they're slow to digest. A man needs to be quick on his feet. Nonsense. Another counters. They give you lasting energy, not just a quick burst like a piece of bread. This is our scholarly debate for the night. Historians still argue whether the dietary choices of Alexander's army were based on a sophisticated understanding of nutrition or simply on tradition and logistics. Was the inclusion of pulses a matter of practicality? They were easy to transport. Or did the Greeks and Macedonians have an intuitive understanding of the benefits of a balanced diet? Perhaps they just knew what made them feel full and strong. The pulses were often prepared as a thick porridge or a stew, sometimes with crushed garlic or onions if they were lucky enough to have any. This was a shared meal, a moment of camaraderie and quiet conversation at the end of a long day. You'd dip your barley bread into the thick, savoury mixture, the hard edges of the bread softening as it soaked up the liquid. The combination of grain and pulse was a powerful one, providing a complete source of protein that kept the men strong and healthy despite the hardships. It was a simple meal, but it was enough. You remember that a soldier in the next unit, the one from Thessaly, had a small, private supply of dried chickpeas he guarded jealously. He would roast them over the fire until they were crunchy, and then snack on them throughout the day. You'd sometimes catch a whiff of the nutty, toasted aroma as you passed his way. This was a rare luxury, a small way to make the hard life a little softer. For most, the pulses were a communal meal, a shared pot that brought men together. You close your eyes, the warmth of the stew in your belly, and you feel the immense weight of all the meals that have sustained armies and empires throughout history. This simple bowl of lentils is a link to all of them, a story of survival told in every spoonful. With a full belly from the lentil stew, you settle in for the night. The air, once so dry and dusty, now has a faint, sweet smell. It's the scent of the evening's libation. You've heard stories of soldiers of other armies drinking straight from their gourds, but that's not the Macedonian way. Here, there is a strict, almost religious approach to the evening's drink. It is not just a beverage, it is a ritual, a social lubricant, and a way to rehydrate. Your mainstream historical fact for this section is that the ancient Greeks and Macedonians almost never drank wine straight. It was considered a barbaric and unsophisticated practice, reserved for foreigners. Instead, they mixed it with water. The typical ratio was 2 parts water to 1 part wine, or even 3 parts water to 1 part wine. This was a cultural practice that went back centuries, a way to dilute the powerful, often unfermented wine into a drink that was refreshing and that you could sip throughout the night without getting too inebriated too quickly. For you, the soldier, this practice was a matter of practicality. A less potent drink meant you could rehydrate and relax without losing your wits. It meant you were more likely to be ready for the morning's march. Now for a quirky tidbit. The wine itself was often stored in large clay amphorae, and these vessels were rarely cleaned out perfectly between uses. This meant that the wine from one batch would often take on a slightly different flavour from the remnants of the previous one, and in the absence of perfect seals, the wine would often get a bit of a sour, almost vinegary taste over time. A soldier might joke that the taste of your wine was a timeline of your campaign, with each passing week adding another layer of complex, slightly sour notes. It was a rustic, unfiltered experience, far from the crisp, clean wines of today. As you sip your watery wine from a simple clay cup, you hear a discussion among the officers nearby. The Persians, one says, with a sneer. They drink their wine unmixed, like animals. Perhaps, another responds, but their wine is so sweet it would give a man a toothache if he drank it straight. This brings us to our scholarly debate for the night. Historians still argue whether the Greek practice of diluting wine was purely a cultural tradition or a public health measure. Was it a way to show civilized restraint and maintain composure, or was it a practical method for making questionable water sources safer to drink? Mixing wine with water would kill some of the bacteria, making it a safer alternative to just drinking from an unknown stream. It's likely a bit of both, a custom that was both culturally significant and highly practical. The wine itself was often made from the wild grapes found in the region. It was a thick, dark, and often pungent liquid, sometimes infused with herbs like thyme or rosemary to improve the flavour and to help with preservation. You'd see a soldier carrying a small, private flask of it, often in a goatskin pouch, which would add a leathery, earthy undertone to the taste. This wasn't a drink you would savour in the way we do today. It was a drink that served a purpose. It helped to rehydrate, to relax, and to create a sense of normalcy in a very abnormal situation. The act of mixing the wine was often a shared moment. A squad would gather around a communal bowl, and each man would take a turn pouring water and wine, the gurgling sound a familiar comfort. The bowl was a focal point, a shared space where stories were told, anxieties were aired, and bonds were strengthened. It wasn't a wild party, but a quiet, contemplative ritual at the end of a long day. You hold your small cup in your hands, the cool clay a comfort. You take a sip, and the watery wine, with its sweet and slightly sour notes, is a gentle balm. You feel the weariness of the day begin to recede, and you are reminded that even in the midst of a great conquest, the simple things, a shared drink, a quiet moment, are what truly sustain a man. You've grown accustomed to the rhythmic thump of a marching army and the endless cycle of grain, olive oil, and watery wine. But as the campaign pushes deeper into unfamiliar lands, the predictable comfort of your rations sometimes gives way to a more chaotic and occasionally more delicious reality, the army. While a marvel of logistics, couldn't always be a self-contained unit. This is the story of how a soldier's diet was shaped by necessity and opportunity, moving beyond the standard rations into the realm of the foraged and the found. Your mainstream historical fact for this section is that foraging and scavenging were a necessary part of a long-term military campaign. While supply wagons did their best to keep up, they couldn't always provide everything needed for a force of tens of thousands of men. This meant that soldiers often supplemented their rations with whatever they could find along the way. You might be sent out with a small group of men to scour the surrounding fields and forests for anything edible. This could be anything from wild asparagus and leeks to mushrooms and wild berries. It was a high-stakes scavenger hunt, with the prize being a temporary escape from the monotony of the standard fare. Here's your quirky tidbit. There's a story told among the men that a soldier once found a beehive, still buzzing with bees, and despite the stings, he managed to get a honeycomb out. He brought it back to camp, and for one night, his squad had a rare and wonderful treat, fresh honey to sweeten their barley bread. It was a small act of bravery and a taste of home that was worth every sting. This story, passed from one man to the next, highlights the resourcefulness and risks the soldiers would take for just a small moment of culinary pleasure. As you chew on a tough, wild carrot you just pulled from the ground, you overhear a debate among some of the older, more experienced soldiers. It's a risk, this foraging, one says. You might come across a plant that makes you sick, or worse. It's better to stick to the rations, another scoffs. The rations will keep you alive, but a man needs more than just survival. A foraged meal is what keeps a man from losing his mind. This is your scholarly debate for the night. Historians still argue whether the reliance on foraging was a sign of a flawed supply chain or a deliberate part of the strategy. Was Alexander's army designed to be flexible and self-sufficient, or was it a logistical compromise forced by the sheer scale of the campaign? The answer probably lies in the middle, a system that was both well-planned but also required constant improvisation. Sometimes, the foraging was less about finding wild plants and more about acquiring food from the local population. This was done either through trade or, more often, through requisitioning. When you came to a village or a town, the commanders would demand a tribute of food to feed the army. This would result in a massive delivery of local produce, fresh fruits, vegetables, and sometimes even a few animals for slaughter. This was a cause for celebration, a moment when the meagre rations were set aside for a night of feasting. You'd get to taste local cheeses, ripe melons, and perhaps a piece of roasted lamb. You find a patch of wild thyme and crush a few of the leaves between your fingers. The scent is strong and clean, a stark contrast to the dust and sweat. You tuck the sprig into your ration bag, a small treasure to add to your next barley and lentil stew. This simple act is a quiet rebellion against the monotony, a way to add a bit of flavour and joy to a life that is otherwise filled with hardship. The foraged foods were more than just calories. They were a link to the land you were in, a tiny taste of the world you were conquering. They were a reminder that even in the midst of a grand and relentless war machine, a person still needed a taste of something fresh and alive. After a day of monotonous marching and the simple fare of barley bread and pulses, a moment of sweetness is a rare and cherished luxury as the sun begins to dip below the horizon, casting a warm, orange glow across the makeshift camp. You find yourself with a small, precious gift, a piece of honeycomb or a small pot of something sticky and sweet. This is the story of how ancient people satisfied their cravings for sugar, a craving we take for granted today. Your mainstream historical fact for this section is that honey was the primary, and often only, sweetener available to the ancient Greeks and Macedonians. Sugar, as we know it, came from sugarcane and was a rare and exotic commodity from the East, if it was known at all. So, for a king like Alexander and his entire army, honey was everything. It was used to sweeten desserts, to glaze roasted meats, and even to preserve fruits. It was a caloric powerhouse, providing a quick burst of energy for tired bodies. A soldier might keep a small leather pouch of honey mixed with nuts and dried fruit, a kind of ancient energy bar for the long march. And here's your quirky tidbit. There's a widespread belief that a particular kind of honey, from bees that fed on certain plants like oleander and rhododendron, could be toxic. This was a form of mad honey. It was known to cause a variety of symptoms, from dizziness to vomiting. A soldier would have to be careful when foraging for honey from wild hives, as it was a small risk that could have a big consequence. This a reminder that even the simple act of finding food in the ancient world could be a gamble. As you scrape a little bit of honey onto your barley bread, you hear a debate among the supply officers. The Persians have sweet syrups, one says. We should try to acquire them. Nonsense, another retorts. The honey we have is from the gods. It is pure and good. The syrups are for soft men. This brings us to our scholarly debate for the night. Historians still argue whether the preference for honey over other sweeteners was a matter of practical availability or a deep-seated cultural reverence. Was honey simply what they had, or was it seen as a superior, more natural form of sweetness, imbued with a divine quality? The truth is likely a combination of both. What was available became what was revered. Beyond its use as a simple food, honey had other, more practical uses. It was an ingredient in a variety of medicinal concoctions. A soldier with a small cut or scrape might have a bit of honey applied to it, as its antibacterial properties were known. If not fully understood, it was also a key ingredient in many drinks. You might see a soldier mix a little bit of honey with water and vinegar to create a refreshing drink called oxymel, which was a popular thirst quencher on hot days. You hold your small pot of honey, its golden, translucent surface catching the last light of the day. The smell is sweet and floral, a pleasant change from the dusty, earthy smells of the camp. You dip your finger in, and the sticky sweetness is a fleeting moment of pure, unadulterated pleasure. It's a taste that connects you to the past in a way that battles and politics can't. It's the taste of a simple luxury, a taste of home, and a taste of the natural world. In a life of endless routine and hardship, this small, sweet moment is a powerful reminder that even in the midst of a grand and brutal campaign, there are still small, everyday joys to be found. You close your eyes, savoring the sweetness, and for a moment, the world of conquest and war melts away, replaced by the simple, peaceful pleasure of a good meal. As the army pushes further east, the familiar tastes and smells of home begin to fade, replaced by the exotic and the new. You've marched through dusty plains and across mighty rivers, and with each mile, the land transforms. This isn't just a geographical journey, it's a culinary one. The food you find now is different, and the spices you encounter are nothing like the wild thyme and rosemary of Macedon. Your mainstream historical fact for this section is that Alexander's campaigns opened up new trade routes and introduced the Greek and Macedonian world to a variety of spices previously unknown to them. Think of the aromatic scents of cumin, coriander, and turmeric. These were spices that, for the most part, were only available through long-distance trade, and even then, they were rare and expensive. Now, you're in the lands where they grow. The food you are now eating, whether foraged or requisitioned, is starting to have a more complex and vibrant flavor profile. A simple stew of lentils and meat, once flavored only with salt and wild herbs, now has a hint of something warm and earthy. It's a small change, but a profound one. Here's your quirky tidbit. There's a story among the soldiers about a group of men who were foraging and found what they thought was a wild onion patch. They took the bulbs back and cooked them, only to discover they were a variety of garlic with a taste so potent it made their eyes water and their noses run for hours. It was a joke for days, a testament to the risks and rewards of foraging in a new land. The men learned quickly that the familiar shapes and smells of home didn't always mean the same things. As you crush a few coriander seeds between your fingers, you hear a debate between the cooks. "This new stuff is too strong," one says. "It overpowers the food." "Nonsense," another replies. "It makes the food come alive." This is our scholarly debate for the night. Historians still argue whether the culinary exchange was a one-way street, with the Macedonians adopting local flavors, or if they also introduced their own cooking methods and ingredients, creating a fusion cuisine. Did the locals start using olive oil, or did the Greeks and Macedonians begin to use ghee? The truth is likely that both sides influenced each other, creating a unique culinary blend that would continue long after Alexander's time. The new spices had a more powerful effect than just on your taste buds. They were believed to have medicinal properties. Cumin, for example, was thought to aid digestion. Turmeric was used for its anti-inflammatory properties. For a soldier, this was a huge bonus. A bit of spice in your food wasn't just about flavor, it was about staying healthy. It was a subtle, almost unnoticed form of battlefield medicine. You watch as a cook, a local from a recently conquered village, adds a pinch of something to a large pot of stew. The scent that rises from the pot is complex and inviting, a stark contrast to the blandness of the meals you've grown used to. It's the aroma of conquest, of cultures colliding and blending. You take a bowl of the stew, and the taste is a revelation. The familiar lentils and barley are still there, but they are transformed. The spice is a whisper of the strange and new, a promise of what lies ahead. You are no longer just a soldier, you are a traveller, a student of the world, and your education is happening one bite at a time. The campaign is no longer just about marching, it's about tasting the world, one fragrant, surprising meal at a time. Your journey with Alexander's army has now brought you to a land of legendary richness and abundance. The hot, dusty plains of Persia are behind you, and before you lies the fertile delta of the Nile River. This is a land of myth and history, and the food here is a world away from the simple fare of Macedon. The army, once a force of rugged individuals, is now a part of a much larger, more diverse tapestry, and its diet reflects this transformation. Your mainstream historical fact for this section is that Egypt was known as the breadbasket of the ancient Mediterranean world. Its fertile soil, thanks to the annual flooding of the Nile River, produced a massive surplus of grain, fruits, and vegetables for Alexander's army. This was a lifeline. It meant a temporary end to the anxieties about supply lines and foraging. You, the soldier, were no longer just a consumer of grain, but a beneficiary of a massive agricultural system. The army's rations, for a time, were bountiful and varied. The simple barley bread was now supplemented with loaves made from fine wheat flour, a rare and welcome luxury. Now for a quirky tidbit. There's a story among the men that the Egyptians had a beer that was so thick it was almost like a liquid bread. It was a fermented drink made from barley or wheat, and it was so nourishing that it was a staple of the Egyptian diet. It was a strange and foreign taste to the Macedonians, who were used to their watery wine, but it was a powerful source of calories and hydration in the hot climate. A soldier might jokingly refer to it as bread in a mug. A new and interesting form of sustenance. This unusual drink highlights the new and sometimes bizarre foods the army encountered on its journey. As you sip a cool cup of this thick, yeasty beer, you overhear a debate between a Greek supply officer and a local Egyptian official. "Your grain is of the highest quality," the Greek says. "But the harvest is so large, how do you manage to store it all?" The Egyptian official smiles. "The pharaoh's granaries are vast," he says. "We could feed your army for a year without trouble." This is our scholarly debate for the night. Historians still argue whether Alexander's conquest of Egypt was a brilliant strategic move to secure a permanent, reliable food source for his entire empire, or if it was simply a lucky accident. Did he understand the full agricultural potential of the Nile Delta from the start, or did he only realize its importance after the fact? The answer, as always, is likely a blend of foresight and good fortune beyond grain. The Nile provided an abundance of other foods. You'd see farmers bringing in baskets of dates, figs, and melons, all ripe and bursting with flavour. The irrigation from the Nile meant that vegetables like leeks, onions, and cucumbers were plentiful. You would even get a taste of the unique foods that came from the river itself, like fish and waterfowl. It was a culinary paradise, a brief but welcome respite from the rigours of the campaign. You get a small piece of a fresh, sweet date. The taste is a burst of sugar, a powerful contrast to the blandness you've grown used to. The date is a small, brown piece of history in your hand, a tangible link to a civilization that has been farming this land for thousands of years. As you eat it, you feel a connection not just to Alexander and his army, but to all the people who have lived and toiled in this fertile valley. You close your eyes, the warmth of the sun on your face, the sweetness of the date on your tongue, and you are reminded that even in the midst of a grand and relentless campaign, there are still small, everyday pleasures to be found. The conquest of Egypt wasn't just about winning a battle, it was about securing a future that was, in large part, built on the humble bounty of the Nile. Leaving the fertile abundance of Egypt, you and the army press onward, deeper into the heart of the Persian Empire. The landscape begins to shift again, and with it, the local customs, architecture, and, most importantly for a hungry soldier, the cuisine. This is the moment when Alexander's genius for assimilation becomes apparent, not just in politics, but in the shared meals of his army. The diet is no longer just Macedonian or Egyptian, it is becoming a blend, a kind of ancient fusion cuisine. Your mainstream historical fact for this section is that as Alexander and his army moved into Persia, they adopted many of the local dining customs and ingredients. This was a deliberate policy of assimilation, a way for Alexander to show respect for the conquered people and to ease the transition of power. You would now see soldiers eating alongside Persian nobles at banquets, and you would see local ingredients and cooking methods incorporated into the army's meals. The once Spartan diet of the Macedonians began to take on the richness and complexity of Persian cooking. This wasn't just about food, it was about culture and diplomacy. Now for a quirky tidbit. There's a story among the men about how they first encountered rice. It was a strange, grain-like plant that was cooked in a way that made it light and fluffy, nothing like the dense, hard barley they were used to. A soldier might joke that it was barley with wings, a kind of impossibly light food. The rice was often cooked with saffron and other spices, giving it a vibrant colour and an intoxicating aroma. This was a new and exciting experience for the men, a taste of a future that would one day see rice as a global staple. As you eat a piece of roasted meat from a skewer, seasoned with spices you don't yet have names for, you overhear a discussion among the commanders. Our men are growing soft with this food, one says. They should stick to the simple fare of our homeland, another replies. Our men are becoming stronger. They are eating the food of a conquered empire. They are learning to live and eat like kings. This is our scholarly debate for the night. Historians still argue whether Alexander's adoption of Persian customs, including their cuisine, was a calculated political move to integrate his new subjects, or if he genuinely grew to appreciate and prefer their more elaborate lifestyle. Was he a conqueror who understood diplomacy, or was he a man who simply had a taste for the finer things in life? The truth is likely a bit of both. A brilliant political mind that was also open to new experiences. The Persian diet was much more diverse than the Macedonian one. You would now see meals that included a variety of fruits, nuts, and vegetables. Pistachios, dates, and pomegranates were now common. The cooking methods were also more sophisticated. Meats were often marinated in fruit juices and spices before being roasted, and vegetables were slow-cooked with oil and herbs. The meals were served not just as a way to get calories, but as a form of art, with dishes arranged in a visually appealing way. You find yourself sitting at a table, not on the ground as you would have done in the past, and you are served a small bowl of a dish you've never seen before. It's a mixture of lentils, rice, and meat, all cooked together with a fragrant mix of spices. The taste is a revelation. It is warm, savoury, and complex. A world away from the simple barley and lentil stew you started with. You take a bite, and for a moment, you are no longer just a soldier. You are a part of a new, expanding world, a world where cultures and cuisines are blending together, creating something new and beautiful. The campaign is no longer just about conquest. It is about taste, about discovery, and about becoming something more than you were before. The grand banquets of Persia, with their exquisite foods and rich spices, are a welcome change, but they are a rare luxury. For the most part, you are still a soldier on the move, and the reality of feeding a massive army on a relentless march across thousands of miles is a logistical nightmare. This is the story of the unsung heroes of the campaign, the supply officers, the cooks, and the humble baggage train. Your mainstream historical fact for this section is that one of Alexander's greatest strategic advantages was his mastery of logistics. He understood that an army truly does march on its stomach. While the common soldier carried a ration bag, the vast majority of the food and supplies were carried in a massive baggage train of wagons and pack animals. This train, often stretching for miles, was the lifeblood of the army. Without it, the campaign would have collapsed. It was a constant, moving city of food, water, and equipment, all designed to keep the fighting men fed and ready. Now for a quirky tidbit. There's a story among the men that Alexander, in a show of both discipline and his famous sense of style, once ordered the baggage train to be streamlined. He reportedly had his own baggage animals' tails trimmed, setting an example for his men. The idea was to show that they could not be encumbered by excess. This anecdote, while possibly apocryphal, highlights the king's obsession with efficiency and his understanding that too much baggage could slow the entire campaign down, making the army vulnerable. As you march alongside one of the lumbering supply wagons, a debate breaks out among the soldiers. "This is too slow," one complains. "We could be moving faster without all these wagons." Another replies, "And then what would we eat? The air?" This is our scholarly debate for the night. Historians still argue whether Alexander's baggage train was an innovative, highly efficient logistical system or a cumbersome necessity that he simply managed better than his predecessors. Was it a mark of his foresight, or was it a product of a campaign that was simply too big to move quickly? The truth, as always, is likely a combination of both. The logistics of feeding the army were incredibly complex. It wasn't just about carrying the food, it was about protecting it, keeping it from spoiling, and distributing it fairly. Supply officers had to constantly be on the lookout for new sources of food, either through foraging, trade, or requisition from local populations. They had to manage a complex system of distribution, ensuring that every soldier, no matter their rank, received their fair share. It was a thankless, difficult job, but it was absolutely essential to the success of the campaign. You watch as a group of men, a mix of Macedonian soldiers and local labourers, work to set up a field kitchen. They are unloading large sacks of grain, casks of wine, and slabs of salted meat. The air is filled with the sounds of their work, the creak of the wagon wheels, the rhythmic clinking of pots and pans, and the low murmur of conversation. This is the unseen army behind the army, the people who made conquest possible. You realize that for all the glory of the battlefield, the true victory often happens in the supply lines. You are handed your ration for the evening. It's a small sack of grain and a piece of dried meat. It's not a feast, but it's enough. You eat it slowly, savoring every bite, and you are filled not just with the energy of the food, but with a sense of gratitude for the complex, moving system that brought it to you. You close your eyes, and you are reminded that the great deeds of history are not just the acts of a single man, but the culmination of the work of countless, often nameless, people. The campaign, you realize, is not just a story of conquest, it is a story of logistics, of supply, and of the unglamorous, but essential, work of keeping a great army fed. Having explored the food of the common soldier and the complexities of the supply chain, our focus now shifts to the man at the very center of it all. You are no longer just a soldier, you're an observer in Alexander's inner circle, a privileged witness to the daily life of a king who, in many ways, was an enigma. The question on everyone's mind is a simple one, but it tells a much larger story. What did Alexander the Great himself eat? Your mainstream historical fact for this section is that, by all accounts, Alexander the Great was a man of remarkable self-control, particularly when it came to his diet. Unlike his father, Philip II, who was known for his love of lavish feasting and hard drinking, Alexander was famously abstemious. He was a man who led from the front, and his eating habits were a reflection of this. He would often eat a simple meal of bread, fish, and a few vegetables, a diet that was barely a step up from that of his men. This was a deliberate choice, a way to show his soldiers that he was no better than they were, that he was willing to endure the same hardships for the sake of the campaign. Now for a quirky tidbit. There's a story told by ancient biographers that Alexander had a famously keen sense of smell. He was reportedly able to tell the quality of wine or the freshness of a dish just by its aroma. It was a kind of superpower in a world where food safety wasn't always a guarantee. A soldier might joke that the king didn't need a cook to tell him if the meat was good, he could just sniff it out. This sensory detail paints a picture of a man who was deeply connected to his surroundings, even in the smallest ways. As you watch Alexander eat, you overhear a discussion among his generals. He eats like a common man, one says, with a hint of admiration. It makes the men respect him. Perhaps, another responds. But a king should have the strength of a lion, and a lion needs to be well fed. This is our scholarly debate for the night. Historians still argue whether Alexander's Spartan diet was a matter of genuine preference or a clever public relations strategy. Was he truly uninterested in the trappings of wealth and power, or was he a shrewd politician who understood that a king who lived like his men would command their loyalty in a way that no tyrant ever could? The truth is probably a bit of both. He was a man who understood the power of a shared meal. While Alexander's personal meals were simple, the feasts he hosted for his commanders and for foreign dignitaries were anything but. These were lavish affairs, designed to showcase his wealth and power. But even at these banquets, Alexander himself would often eat and drink in moderation. He was a spectator, not a participant in the gluttony. He would use the feasts as a tool for diplomacy, a way to build relationships and to show his respect for the local customs. The food, in his hands, was not just sustenance, it was a political statement. You see a servant bring a small, simple meal to Alexander's tent. It's a small piece of roasted meat, a few pieces of fruit, and a slice of bread. There are no fancy sauces or exotic spices. It's the meal of a man who is focused on a larger goal, a man who knows that the true strength of an army comes not from the richness of its food, but from the loyalty of its men. You are reminded that greatness is often found not in the things we consume, but in the things we choose to do without. Alexander's diet was a powerful message to his men, a silent promise that he would never ask them to endure a hardship he himself was unwilling to share. The sun beats down on your back, and the constant march wears on your patience. But the greatest enemy in this campaign isn't an army, it's the inexorable force of time and heat. Food, no matter how plentiful, spoils. This is a problem that has plagued armies and civilizations since the dawn of history, and the solutions were often as creative as they were simple. This is the story of how Alexander's army kept its food from going bad, with a special focus on a very old, very effective, and very sour method. Your mainstream historical fact for this section is that ancient peoples relied heavily on fermentation and acidification to preserve food. Think of things we still use today: pickling, salting, and drying. But one of the most common and effective ways to preserve food was to turn it into a form of vinegar. Vinegar, or oxos in Greek, was created from sour wine. The wine would be left to ferment, and the bacteria in the air would turn the alcohol into acetic acid. This acidic liquid was then used to preserve vegetables, fruits, and even some meats. It was a simple, cheap, and reliable way to extend the shelf life of food, a necessity for a long campaign. Here's your quirky tidbit. There's a story among the soldiers about a time when a new recruit, unfamiliar with the process, accidentally drank a jug of pure, undiluted vinegar. He was sick for a day, and the other men joked that he had turned into a pickle. The story, while likely exaggerated, highlights the potency of the stuff and the fact that it was not a drink on its own, but a powerful preserving agent. It was a reminder that in the ancient world, even the most basic substances could be dangerous if used improperly, as you dip a piece of bread into a small bowl of preserved olives. You overhear a debate among the cooks. The salt works better, one says. It's what our ancestors have always used. Perhaps, another counters. But the vinegar adds a flavour, a kick. It makes the boring food interesting. This is our scholarly debate for the night. Historians still argue whether the preference for certain preservation methods was a matter of cultural tradition or simply what was most practical for a given food. Was vinegar a choice because it worked best for vegetables? Or was it a choice because it was a byproduct of their wine culture? The answer is likely a little of both. A method that was both practical and ingrained in their way of life. The preserved foods were a vital part of the army's diet. You'd see large clay pots filled with vegetables, cucumbers, onions, and garlic, all submerged in a sour, briny liquid. These foods, while not as fresh as those found in a fertile valley, were a reliable source of vitamins and minerals for a soldier on the move. A few preserved onions or a handful of pickled garlic could be the difference between health and illness. They were a taste of a harvest from a week or a month ago, a tangible link to a past moment of abundance. You are given a small piece of a preserved fig. It is tough and chewy, and the sour taste of the vinegar is a shock to your system. But as you chew it, you realize that it's a small victory. It is a piece of food that has defied time, a small triumph of human ingenuity over the forces of nature. You are reminded that the great deeds of history are often built on the smallest and most mundane of things, like a preserved fig. The campaign, you realize, is not just a story of conquest. It is a story of survival, of cunning, and of the unglamorous, but essential, work of keeping a great army fed. After months of marching through arid landscapes, the constant craving for something fresh and different is a familiar ache. But as the army reaches the coastal regions of Anatolia and, later, the shores of the Mediterranean, the diet begins to shift again. The endless fields of grain are still there, but now, a new source of protein and flavor makes its way onto the menu. This is the story of how Alexander's army rediscovered the bounty of the sea. Your mainstream historical fact for this section is that fish and other seafood were a staple of the ancient Greek diet, particularly in coastal areas, for an army that had been living on a diet of mostly grain and pulses. The appearance of fresh fish was a cause for celebration. It was a source of lean protein that was not always available in the interior of the continent. You would now see soldiers and cooks working together to catch fish from the sea or from local rivers and lakes. This was a welcome change, a brief and delicious escape from the monotony of the standard rations. Here's your quirky tidbit. There's a story among the men about a fisherman who used a net so large it could catch an entire school of fish at once. The men would joke that he was a fisherman, but his nets were for an army. The truth is that the local people, from the coastal regions, were experts at their craft, and they often provided massive amounts of fish to the army, either through trade or as a form of tribute. This was a testament to the local knowledge and the ingenuity of the people who lived in these regions. As you sit by a fire, grilling a small fish you managed to catch, you overhear a debate between a Macedonian officer and a Greek sailor who has been attached to the army. "The sea is a fickle mistress," the Macedonian says. "Give me a good ox any day." The sailor laughs. "The sea is an endless larder," he replies. "She will always provide." This is our scholarly debate for the night. Historians still argue whether Alexander's strategic decisions were always driven by a desire for territorial expansion, or if they were sometimes influenced by practical needs, like access to reliable food sources. Did he conquer the coastal cities for their ports and trade, or for their abundant fishing grounds? The answer is likely both, a blend of military strategy and logistical necessity. Beyond just the fresh catch, the army would also acquire salted and dried fish. This was a vital form of preservation that allowed the army to carry the bounty of the sea with them for a time. The salted fish was tough and incredibly salty, but it provided a powerful punch of protein and flavor. It was often rehydrated and cooked in a stew with vegetables and herbs. A simple but satisfying meal that was a welcome change from the tough, dried meat of the interior. You hold the grilled fish in your hands, its skin crisp and its flesh flaky and white. The smell is a memory of home, a taste of a world you have left behind. You take a bite, and the taste is clean and pure, a stark contrast to the heavy, earthy flavors of the land. It's a moment of quiet contentment, a brief connection to a world of simple pleasures. You are reminded that even in the midst of a grand and relentless campaign, there are still moments of pure, simple joy to be found. The campaign, you realize, is not just a story of conquest. It is a story of a long and difficult journey, and the small, simple comforts that sustain you along the way. You've had your fill of fresh fish and the salty tang of the sea, but the army is a land-based force, and the majority of its diet is from the earth, not the water. And among the staples, one of the most versatile and nutritious is a food that has been a part of human history for millennia. This is the story of how Alexander's army used milk and its derivatives, particularly cheese, to fuel their conquest. Your mainstream historical fact for this section is that cheese, made from the milk of sheep or goats, was a foundational food in the ancient world. It was a perfect food for a marching army. It was easy to transport, required no cooking, and was an excellent source of protein, fat, and calories. You would often receive a hard, salty chunk of it in your rations, and it would be a welcome addition to the bland barley bread. It could be eaten as is, crumbled into a stew, or mixed with water to create a kind of cheesy paste. It was a food that was both a luxury and a necessity, a taste of home that was also a tool for survival. Here's your quirky tidbit. There's a story among the men about a soldier who, in a moment of boredom, decided to use a piece of hard cheese to hone the edge of his spear. The cheese, being so hard and dense, actually worked, albeit not very well. The story was a joke for days, a testament to the versatility of this food and the endless ingenuity of a bored soldier. This humorous anecdote highlights the practical and sometimes bizarre uses of the foods that kept the army going. As you sit by a fire, gnawing on a piece of salty cheese, you overhear a debate among some of the older soldiers. "The goat cheese is best, one says. "It's what our families have made for generations." Another disagrees. "The sheep cheese is creamier, and it keeps better on the march." This is our scholarly debate for the night. Historians still argue whether the prevalence of goat and sheep cheese was purely a matter of which animals were more common, or if there was a culinary preference for their specific flavors and textures. Was it a choice of practicality or a matter of taste? The answer is likely a bit of both. A method that was both practical and ingrained in their way of life. Beyond just a simple ration, cheese was often a key ingredient in many dishes. You'd see cooks crumbling it into a stew of lentils and vegetables, the salty, tangy flavor transforming the simple meal into something hearty and delicious. You might also see it mixed with honey and nuts to create a kind of ancient dessert, a rare treat in a life of hardship. It was a food that could be both a main course and a condiment, a testament to its versatility. You hold the small, hard chunk of cheese in your hands. Its salty aroma is a comfort, a reminder of the simple, but powerful, foods that are fueling this incredible journey. You take a bite, and the taste is a burst of salt and tang, a powerful contrast to the blandness of the barley bread. It's a taste of a long history, a food that has sustained shepherds, farmers, and soldiers for thousands of years. You close your eyes, the warmth of the fire on your face, the salty taste in your mouth, and you are reminded that the great deeds of history are not just the acts of a single man, but the culmination of the work of countless, often nameless, people, and the simple, but powerful foods that sustained them. The campaign, you realize, is not just a story of conquest, it is a story of survival, of cunning, and of the unglamorous, but essential, work of keeping a great army fed. You've journeyed with Alexander's army across arid deserts, fertile deltas, and coastal plains. The diet has changed with the landscape, but as you approach the Indus River and the subcontinent of India, you are about to encounter a truly new and incredible world of flavor and food. This is the story of how the army discovered a new bounty of fruits and vegetables, and a whole new way of eating. Your mainstream historical fact for this section is that the Indian subcontinent, with its tropical climate and incredibly fertile soil, produced a variety of fruits and vegetables that were completely unknown to the Greek and Macedonian world. Think of bananas, mangoes, and a variety of citrus fruits. For a soldier who had been eating dried figs and dates as a rare treat, these new fruits were a revelation. They were a burst of fresh flavor and vitamins, a delicious antidote to the tough, dry rations of the campaign. The army, for a time, was in a culinary paradise, with an endless supply of fresh produce. Here's your quirky tidbit. There's a story among the men about the first time they saw a banana tree. They thought the fruit was some kind of strange, inedible gourd. A soldier, curious, tried to peel one, and the resulting mess and discovery of the soft, sweet fruit was a source of great laughter. The men were a part of a great conquest, but they were also just a group of men discovering a new world, one strange food at a time. This simple moment of discovery highlights the human and sometimes humorous side of a grand historical event. As you peel a sweet, yellow banana, you overhear a debate among the officers. "This fruit is a luxury," one says. "We should be focused on building granaries and securing our supply lines." Another replies, "This fruit is a morale booster." Historians still argue whether Alexander's prolonged stay in India was a strategic pause to consolidate his gains, or if he and his men were so captivated by the richness of the land and its culture that they simply didn't want to leave. Was it a political decision or a moment of sensory overload? The truth is likely a bit of both. Beyond the fruits, the army encountered a wide variety of vegetables and spices. You would see cooks using eggplant, okra, and a variety of gourds that they had never seen before. The spices, which were already becoming more common in the Persian portion of the campaign, were now used in a new and exciting way. Cardamom, cinnamon, and black pepper were now readily available, and they were used to create a more complex and aromatic cuisine. The simple stews and roasted meats of the past were now being transformed into something new and wonderful. You bite into a small piece of a ripe, juicy mango. The sweetness is a shock to your system, a flavor that is both new and incredibly delicious. You are reminded that the great deeds of history are not just the acts of a single man, but the culmination of the work of countless, often nameless, people, and the simple, but powerful, foods that sustained them. The campaign, you realize, is not just a story of conquest. It is a story of discovery, of a new world, and of the unglamorous, but essential, work of keeping a great army fed. You've tasted the strange, new foods of India, But you can't help but wonder about the foods that have been lost to time. We know what Alexander and his men ate from historical accounts and archaeological finds. But what about the recipes? What about the specific methods of preparation, the subtle spice blends, the techniques that were passed down from one generation to the next? This is the story of the lost recipe scrolls, and what we can still infer from the fragments that remain. Your mainstream historical fact for this section is that while many ancient texts on philosophy, politics, and warfare survived, detailed culinary texts are rare. The vast majority of recipes and cooking knowledge were passed down orally, from mother to daughter, from cook to apprentice. So, while we know that ancient Macedonians ate barley bread and lentils, we don't know the specific ratios, the secret ingredient, or the precise cooking time that made one person's stew legendary and another's merely edible. We have the ingredients, but we are missing the instructions. Here's your quirky tidbit. There's a story among the scholars that one of Alexander's scribes, a man named Cleisthenes, once tried to write down the recipe for a roasted goat that was served at a banquet. He was so meticulous that he tried to capture every detail, from the herbs used to the exact temperature of the fire. The story goes that he failed, because the cook, a gruff old woman from Persia, cooked by feel and instinct, not by measurement. She could not explain her art, only perform it. This anecdote highlights the difference between written history and the more fluid, unwritten history of everyday life. As you sit by the fire, listening to the men talk, you overhear a debate among some of the officers. "We should have brought more scribes," one says. "We could have recorded all the knowledge of this empire," another replies. "What good is a recipe if you don't have the hands to make it?" The knowledge is in the people, not in the scrolls. This is our scholarly debate for the night. Historians still argue whether the loss of ancient culinary texts was a deliberate act of historical erasure or simply a matter of practicality. Was food considered too mundane to be written down, or did the fragility of the scrolls and the oral tradition of cooking simply make it impossible for these recipes to survive? The truth is likely a combination of both. Despite the lack of detailed recipes, we can infer a great deal from the ingredients that were found at archaeological sites. The presence of certain spices in a pot, the type of grinding stones used, and the remnants of food on ancient plates all tell a story. We can infer that their food was often a one-pot meal, a stew or a porridge, and that the flavour was built in layers, with each ingredient added at the right time. We can guess that they cooked over an open fire, a simple but effective method that required skill and intuition. You hold a small, flat piece of baked clay in your hand. It's a fragment of a pot, and you can still see the faint, dark residue of a meal from thousands of years ago. It's not a recipe, but it is a ghost of a meal. It's a reminder that even when the words are gone, the stories of food and life remain. You close your eyes, and you can almost smell the stew, hear the crackling fire, and feel the warmth of a shared meal. The history of food, you realize, is not just about the words that were written, but about the flavors that were shared and the memories that were created. The campaign is not just a story of conquest, it is a story of a long and difficult journey, and the small, simple comforts that sustain you along the way. The journey with Alexander's army has been a study in survival and a culinary expedition. But beyond just sustenance and flavor, food in the ancient world had another vital function. It was deeply intertwined with health and medicine. A soldier's diet wasn't just about calories, it was about staying healthy in a world with no antibiotics and very little understanding of disease. This is the story of ancient food as medicine. Your mainstream historical fact for this section is that ancient physicians, including those who accompanied Alexander, believed that a person's health was directly related to the balance of their body's humours. They saw food not just as a source of energy, but as a way to maintain this balance and to treat illness. A person with a fever, for example, might be given cold foods like cucumbers or melons, while someone with a chill might be given hot foods like garlic or onions. This was a system of health that was based on observation and a deep, albeit not always accurate, understanding of the properties of food. Here's your quirky tidbit. There's a story among the medics that Alexander himself, after a long march in the sun, would sometimes ask for a drink of barley water mixed with honey and a pinch of salt. The medics believed this concoction would cool his humours and prevent him from getting sick. We, with our modern understanding, Know that this was an early form of a rehydration drink, replacing the electrolytes lost through sweat. It was a simple, practical solution to a common problem, a testament to the ancient world's ability to find solutions to problems without a full scientific understanding of why they worked. As you chew on a piece of a preserved fig, which was believed to be good for digestion, you overhear a debate between a Greek physician and an older soldier. "You should eat more garlic," the physician says. "It will keep you strong and ward off disease." "Nonsense, the soldier replies. "The gods will decide my fate, not a piece of garlic." This is our scholarly debate for the night. Historians still argue whether the medical use of food was a form of folk wisdom or a sophisticated system of ancient science. Was it based on superstition and ritual, or was it a form of early empirical observation, where people noticed that certain foods seemed to make them feel better and so they used them as medicine? The truth is likely a combination of both, a blend of tradition and observation, beyond just the humours. Certain foods were believed to have specific properties. Onions and garlic were thought to be blood purifiers, lentils were believed to be good for the heart, and olive oil was considered a powerful anti-inflammatory. For a soldier, this was a vital part of his daily routine. He might rub olive oil on his aching muscles at the end of a long day, or he might chew on a piece of garlic before going into a battle, a small piece of ritual to keep him safe. You are given a small piece of a dried pomegranate, a fruit that was believed to be good for the heart and for the soul. The taste is a burst of sour and sweet, a flavour that is both new and incredibly delicious. You are reminded that the great deeds of history are not just the acts of a single man, but the culmination of the work of countless, often nameless, people, and the simple but powerful foods that sustained them. The campaign, you realise, is not just a story of conquest. It is a story of a long and difficult journey, and the small, simple comforts that sustain you along the way. You've learned that Alexander's army was a moving city, fueled by grain, pulses, and the occasional piece of meat. You've seen that wine was a key part of their diet, but that it was always diluted. But what about all the other things a man needs to drink in a world without clean, running water? What did a soldier drink to quench his thirst? This is the story of the beverages beyond wine, the humble liquids that kept a massive army hydrated and healthy on a long and difficult campaign. Your mainstream historical fact for this section is that the most common drink for a soldier, and indeed for most people in the ancient world, was water. But this was not the clean, filtered water we know today. It was often drawn from rivers, lakes, or wells, and it was often filled with a variety of bacteria and other microorganisms that could make a person sick. The practice of diluting wine with water was not just about making the wine less potent, it was a way to make the water safer to drink. The alcohol in the wine, and the acidity of a slightly soured wine, would help to kill some of the pathogens. It was a simple, but effective, form of ancient water purification. Here's your quirky tidbit. There's a story among the men about a soldier who, in a moment of extreme thirst, drank directly from a stagnant pond. He was sick for a day, and the other men joked that he had swallowed a small army of frogs. The story, while likely an exaggeration, highlights the very real dangers of drinking contaminated water. It was a constant threat, and the men learned to be careful about where they got their water. Even in the midst of a grand military campaign, as you fill your water skin from a clear, flowing river, you overhear a debate among some of the officers. "We should be more careful about the water," one says. "A sick army is a defeated army," another replies. "The gods will protect us." A man should not live in fear of a little mud. This is our scholarly debate for the night. Historians still argue whether Alexander's rapid advance through the arid lands of Asia was a testament to his logistical genius, or if it was a risky gamble that relied on a bit of luck to find enough clean water for his men and animals. Did he have a plan for every river and every well? Or was he just a charismatic leader who believed that fortune favoured the bold? The truth is likely a combination of both. Beyond just water, the army also drank a variety of other beverages. You might see a soldier mixing water with a little bit of vinegar to create posca, a sour and refreshing drink that was a favourite of the Roman legions and likely used by the Greeks and Macedonians as well. This drink was cheap, easy to make, and it helped to quench a soldier's thirst on a hot day. You might also see them drinking a form of thick, yeasty beer, especially in the regions where it was a local staple. This beer, while not as clean as our modern varieties, was a source of calories and hydration. You hold your water skin in your hand, and you take a long, satisfying drink of the cool, clean water from the river. It's a simple pleasure, a luxury in a world where water is often a source of danger. You are reminded that the great deeds of history are not just the acts of a single man, but the culmination of the work of countless, often nameless, people, and the simple but powerful things that sustained them. The campaign, you realize, is not just a story of conquest. It is a story of a long and difficult journey, and the small, simple comforts that sustain you along the way. You've seen how food and drink sustained a massive army, but the act of eating and drinking was more than just a matter of survival. It was a cultural and social event, a way for a community of soldiers to come together and create a sense of normalcy in a very abnormal situation. This is the story of how food shaped the social rituals and cultural identity of Alexander's army. Your mainstream historical fact for this section is that the act of dining in the ancient Greek and Macedonian world was a highly ritualized affair. It wasn't just about getting calories in, it was about social bonding, political maneuvering, and religious observance. The symposium, a kind of drinking party, was a key part of this. It was a gathering of men who would recline on couches, eat, drink, and engage in philosophical discussion, poetry recitation, and political debate. For a soldier, a shared meal was a miniature version of this, a way to bond with his fellow soldiers and to forget, for a time, the dangers of the campaign. Here's your quirky tidbit. There's a story among the men about a soldier who, at a symposium, recited a poem so terrible that the other men, in a form of ancient social punishment, made him drink his wine straight, without water. The act was a joke, but it highlights the importance of social rules and the way that food and drink were used to enforce them. A shared meal was not a free-for-all, it was a highly structured event with its own set of unwritten rules. As you share a bowl of stew with your companions, you overhear a debate among the officers. "We are losing our way," one says. "We are not eating like Macedonians anymore," another replies. "We are becoming something more." Historians still argue whether the culinary exchange was a one-way street, with the Macedonians adopting local flavors, or if they also introduced their own cooking methods and ingredients, creating a fusion cuisine. Did the locals start using olive oil, or did the Greeks and Macedonians begin to use ghee? The truth is likely that both sides influenced each other, creating a unique culinary blend that would continue long after Alexander's time. The communal meal was a powerful tool for building social cohesion. A small squad of 10 men would often cook and eat together. This was a way to share resources, to divide labor, and to build a sense of camaraderie. The meal was a moment of quiet conversation, of storytelling, of laughter. It was a time when the men could be themselves, to talk about their families, their fears, and their hopes for the future. It was a brief escape from the reality of the war. You are handed a small piece of flatbread, and you dip it into the shared stew. The warmth of the food, the smell of the spices, and the quiet conversation of your companions all combine to create a sense of peace and belonging. You are reminded that the great deeds of history are not just the acts of a single man, but the culmination of the work of countless, often nameless, people. The campaign, you realize, is not just a story of conquest, it is a story of a long and difficult journey, and the small, simple comforts that sustain you along the way. The food, you realize, is not just about calories, it is about community, culture, and the very human need to belong. You've seen how a communal meal can bond an army. But for Alexander, the act of dining was often more than just a simple ritual. It was a tool, a form of diplomacy and a way to project power and build relationships. This is the story of how Alexander the Great used feasts, not just to feed his men, but to conquer hearts and minds. Your mainstream historical fact for this section is that Alexander would host massive banquets for both his Macedonian commanders and for the nobles of the conquered lands. These feasts were not just celebrations, they were a form of political theatre. He would invite local leaders to dine with him, a gesture of respect that was also a powerful message of his authority. The very act of sharing food and drink was a way to break down barriers and to create a sense of camaraderie between the conquerors and the conquered. It was a strategy of assimilation through conviviality. Here's your quirky tidbit. There's a story among the scholars that at one such feast in Persia, Alexander had his generals exchange cups with the Persian nobles, a symbolic act of friendship. The Macedonians, who were used to their simple, diluted wine, were surprised by the sweet, undiluted wine of the Persians. A few of the generals, unused to the potency of the drink, became quite inebriated, much to the amusement of all. This small, humorous moment highlights the cultural differences that were being bridged, one cup at a time, as you stand on the edge of a massive banquet hall, watching the revelry unfold. You overhear a debate among the Persian officials. "He honors us with this feast," one says. "He is not like the other conquerors," another, more cynical, replies. "He feeds us his bread so that we will swallow his rule." This is our scholarly debate for the night. Historians still argue whether Alexander's feasting was a genuine expression of his desire for a blended empire or a clever political ploy to disarm his new subjects. Was he a true believer in a Hellenic-Persian fusion, or was he a shrewd politician who understood that a full belly and a good glass of wine could make a conquered people more compliant? The truth is likely a combination of both. The feasts were also a way for Alexander to reward his men. He would hold great banquets to celebrate victories, and he would shower his men with gifts and praise. These feasts were a way to maintain the loyalty of his army, to show them that their sacrifices were not in vain. The food, in this context, was a symbol of reward, a tangible sign of their success. The act of dining with their king was an honor that reinforced their dedication to him. You are given a small piece of a roasted bird, glazed with a sweet sauce. It is a taste of a luxury you have not experienced in a long time. You are reminded that the great deeds of history are not just the acts of a single man, but the culmination of the work of countless, often nameless, people. The campaign, you realize, is not just a story of conquest. It is a story of a long and difficult journey, and the small, simple comforts that sustain you along the way, the food, you realize, is not just about calories. It is about community, culture, and the very human need to belong. The feasts, you now understand, were a quiet, powerful form of conquest, a way to win over hearts and minds without ever drawing a sword. You've seen how feasts were used for political ends, but for the vast majority of the army, the daily struggle was more basic. How does a simple grain of barley go from a field to your mess bowl? This is the story of the journey of food, a logistical miracle that made a grand campaign possible. You are no longer just an observer. You are now following a single grain of wheat from its cultivation to its consumption. Your mainstream historical fact for this section is that ancient warfare was a seasonal affair, largely because of agriculture. Armies would often campaign in the spring and summer and then return to their homelands for the harvest. Alexander's army, however, was a constant force on the move to feed it. His logistical officers had to be masters of both supply and acquisition. They would scout ahead, identifying fertile regions where they could requisition or purchase grain, and then they would have to move it. The grain, once harvested, would be threshed and winnowed right in the field, and then it would be loaded into massive sacks and onto pack animals or wagons. This was a massive, labor-intensive process, a quiet, unglamorous part of the conquest that was just as vital as any battle. Here's your quirky tidbit. There's a story among the supply officers that a group of local farmers, in an attempt to make their grain sacks lighter for transport, would secretly fill them with sand. The ruse was discovered when a clever cook noticed that the flour from those sacks produced a very gritty, unappealing bread. The farmers, of course, were punished. But the story was a cautionary tale about the constant vigilance required to keep the supply lines honest and efficient. As you help a few men unload a massive sack of grain, you overhear a debate among the cooks. "The grain from Egypt is the best," one says. "It's clean and makes a beautiful bread." Another replies, "The grain from Persia is tougher, it makes a hardier bread, good for a long journey." This is our scholarly debate for the night. Historians still argue whether Alexander's supply chain was a testament to his foresight in planning, or if it was a system of constant, on-the-fly improvisation. Did he have a grand master plan for feeding his army? Or did he simply adapt to the lands he was conquering? The truth is likely a combination of both. A brilliant mind that could plan for the future but was also quick to adapt to a changing reality. Once the grain was in camp, it had to be prepared for a massive army. This was a huge undertaking. The grain would be ground into a coarse flour using hand mills or larger, more stationary grinding stones. The flour would then be mixed with water and kneaded into a tough dough. This dough would then be baked on a hot stone or in a small clay oven. It was a repetitive, monotonous task, but it was absolutely essential. You watch as a cook, his hands covered in flour, kneads a massive lump of dough. The rhythmic sound of his work is a comfort, a sign that dinner is coming. You are reminded that the great deeds of history are not just the acts of a single man, but the culmination of the work of countless, often nameless, people. The campaign, you realize, is not just a story of conquest, it is a story of a long and difficult journey, and the unglamorous, but essential, work of keeping a great army fed. The journey from field to table, you now understand, was a quiet, constant battle, one that had to be won every single day. You have a mouthful of freshly baked bread, a small victory in a world of hardship. But while bread and grain were the staples, there were other foods that were a cause for celebration. This is the story of how Alexander's army enjoyed the spoils of a successful hunt or a bountiful raid, with a focus on the most prized of all foods, roasted meat. Your mainstream historical fact for this section is that roasted meat, especially from an ox or a wild boar, was a prized part of a feast in the ancient world. For a soldier who had been living on a diet of mostly grains and pulses, a meal of roasted meat was a luxury, a symbol of a good day and a successful hunt. It was a caloric powerhouse, providing the protein and fat needed for a life of constant physical exertion. The meat would be skewered and roasted over an open fire, the fat dripping and sizzling, the smell a delicious siren song to hungry men. Here's your quirky tidbit. There's a story among the cooks that Alexander's personal cook, a man named Lysias, had a secret recipe for a roasted boar. He would reportedly marinate the boar for days in a mixture of wine, honey, and herbs before roasting it. The resulting meat was so tender and flavorful that it was said to melt in your mouth. The story, while likely a fable, highlights the importance of the cooks and the effort they put into their craft. Even in the middle of a war, as you stand by the fire, watching a whole ox being roasted, you overhear a debate among the men. The roasted meat is good, one says, but I prefer the stews. They fill you up and last for days. Another replies, the stews are for survival. The roasted meat is for living. Historians still argue whether the consumption of meat was a matter of cultural preference or a logistical necessity. Was meat a luxury reserved for special occasions, or was it a regular part of the army's diet when they could get it? The truth is likely that it was both, a rare treat that was savoured whenever the opportunity arose, beyond just the taste. The act of roasting a large animal was a social event. It would bring a whole unit together, and it was a moment of celebration. The men would gather around the fire, sharing stories and laughter, as the delicious aroma of the roasting meat filled the air. It was a moment of camaraderie, a brief escape from the reality of the war. The roasted meat, in this context, was not just food, it was a symbol of a community coming together. You are handed a small piece of the roasted ox. It is juicy and tender, and the taste is a burst of flavour that you have not experienced in a long time. You are reminded that the great deeds of history are not just the acts of a single man, but the culmination of the work of countless, often nameless, people. The campaign, you realise, is not just a story of conquest, it is a story of a long and difficult journey, and the small, simple comforts that sustain you along the way. The roasted meat, you now understand, was a quiet, powerful form of conquest, a way to win over hearts and minds without ever drawing a sword. You feasted on roasted meat, but let's be honest, that was a rare treat for the vast majority of your meals. The core was always the same. This is the story of the one food that truly fueled the ancient world, the food that was a constant companion to every meal. From a simple soldier's ration to a king's banquet, bread. Your mainstream historical fact for this section is that bread was the absolute cornerstone of the ancient Greek and Macedonian diet. It was more than just a food, it was a symbol of civilization. A person who ate bread was considered civilized, while a person who ate only meat or wild plants was considered a barbarian. The bread itself was often a simple flatbread made from barley or wheat flour, water, and sometimes a little salt. It was dense and heavy, but it was a reliable source of carbohydrates and calories. You would often receive a daily ration of it, and it was a comfort, a constant in a world of constant change. Here's your quirky tidbit. There's a story among the soldiers that in a moment of extreme hunger, a man tried to eat a piece of a leather shield. He was, of course, unsuccessful, and the other men joked that he should have just stuck to the bread. This anecdote, while possibly apocryphal, highlights the importance of bread as a fundamental source of nourishment. It was a food that was always there, a reliable and trustworthy companion. As you break off a piece of your hard, unleavened bread, you overhear a debate among some of the cooks. The Egyptian wheat makes a light, airy bread, one says. It's the best in the world, another replies. The barley bread from home is a true soldier's bread. It is tough, and it sticks to your ribs. It is the food of conquerors. This is our scholarly debate for the night. Historians still argue whether the preference for barley over wheat was purely a matter of practical logistics, barley was more resilient and cheaper, or if there was a cultural preference for it among the Macedonians and Greeks of that time. Perhaps it was a bit of both. The simple fact remains that for Alexander's army, the journey of conquest was powered by this unglamorous grain. The bread was often made in a very simple way. The flour would be mixed with water and kneaded into a tough dough. This dough would then be baked on a hot stone or in a small clay oven. The resulting flatbread, or maza, was tough and dense. You'd break it off in chunks and dip it in whatever you had, a little olive oil, some wine, or maybe just a bit of water to soften it. It wasn't a gourmet experience, but every bite was a deposit of energy for the day to come. You hold your piece of bread in your hands. It is warm and solid, a tangible link to a world of simple comforts. You are reminded that the great deeds of history are not just the acts of a single man, but the culmination of the work of countless, often nameless, people, and the simple, but powerful, foods that sustained them. The campaign, you realize, is not just a story of conquest. It is a story of a long and difficult journey, and the unglamorous, but essential, work of keeping a great army fed. The bread, you now understand, was a quiet, constant battle, one that had to be won every single day. You've learned about all the foods that sustained Alexander's army, the grains, the pulses, the occasional roasted meat, and the strange fruits of new lands. But as you sit here, thinking about the ancient world, it's just as interesting to consider what was completely absent from their diet, a food so common to us today that its absence is almost unimaginable. This is the story of the one food you won't find on Alexander's menu. Your mainstream historical fact for this section is that potatoes, a staple food for a large portion of the world's population today, were completely unknown in the ancient world. They are native to the Andes Mountains of South America and were not introduced to Europe until the 16th century, thousands of years after Alexander's time. This means that a food that we often take for granted, from French fries to mashed potatoes, was simply not a part of their culinary landscape. Their primary sources of carbohydrates were grains, like barley and wheat, not starchy tubers. Here's your quirky tidbit. There's a story told among the men, a sort of recurring joke about a soldier who, in a moment of extreme hunger, tried to cook a large, strange root he found in the ground. He cooked it for hours, but it remained hard and inedible. The men joked that he had tried to cook a rock. The story, while likely a fable, highlights the fact that the men were not used to eating tubers and were not familiar with how to prepare them. The root in question was likely a wild turnip or a similar vegetable, but in the soldier's mind, it was a culinary mystery. As you sit by the fire, eating a bowl of lentil stew, you overhear a debate among some of the older soldiers. This is a good, solid meal, one says. It keeps a man going. Another replies, it is good, but I wish we had something else to go with it. A different kind of vegetable? Maybe? This is our scholarly debate for the night. Historians still argue whether ancient diets were nutritionally complete without foods like the potato. Was the reliance on grains and pulses a matter of practicality, or did it lead to nutritional deficiencies that we are not aware of? The truth is that the ancient diet was, for the most part, quite healthy, with a wide variety of fresh vegetables, fruits, and legumes. But the absence of a food like the potato shows us just how much our modern diet has changed. The absence of the potato is a powerful reminder of how interconnected the world is today. A food that is a part of our daily lives was a complete unknown just a few hundred years ago. It reminds us that our history is not just a story of what was, but also of what wasn't. It's a testament to the slow, painstaking process of discovery and cultural exchange that has shaped our world. You close your eyes, and you can almost imagine a world with a potato, a world where a soldier, after a long march, could have a hot, savoury baked potato instead of a hard piece of barley bread. But you open your eyes, and you are back in a world without it. You are reminded that the great deeds of history are not just the acts of a single man, but the culmination of the work of countless, often nameless, people, and the simple, but powerful, foods that sustained them. The campaign, you realize, is not just a story of conquest. It is a story of a long and difficult journey, and the unglamorous, but essential, work of keeping a great army fed. The absence of the potato, you now understand, is a quiet, powerful reminder of just how far the world has come. You've seen the food of a soldier and the food of a king. Now, let's go deeper into the social side of eating, especially when you're no longer in a dusty camp, but in a grand banquet hall. This is the story of banquet hall etiquette, the unwritten rules and customs that governed the most important meals of the ancient world. Your mainstream historical fact for this section is that ancient banquets were highly ritualized affairs, especially in Persia. The seating arrangements were a matter of strict protocol, with the most important guests seated closest to the king. The food was served in a specific order, and the wine was poured in a specific way. This was a social minefield, a place where a single mistake in etiquette could be a huge insult. For a Macedonian soldier who was used to eating on the ground with his companions, this was a new and sometimes confusing world. It was a world where a shared meal was less about food and more about power, hierarchy, and social standing. Here's your quirky tidbit. There's a story among the men about a soldier who, at a Persian banquet, used his fingers to scoop up a piece of food, a perfectly normal thing to do in a Macedonian camp. The Persian nobles, who were used to using small spoons and forks for such dishes, were reportedly horrified. The soldier, of course, was mortified. The story highlights the vast cultural differences that were being bridged, one awkward meal at a time. It's a reminder that even in the most mundane of acts, like eating, cultures can clash in surprising ways. As you sit at a lavish Persian table, carefully navigating the social rules, you overhear a debate among the Macedonian officers. "This is all nonsense," one says. "A man should eat when he's hungry, not when the rules tell him to," another replies. "The rules are what separate us from the barbarians." Historians still argue whether Alexander's adoption of Persian customs, including their dining etiquette, was a deliberate political move to integrate his new subjects, or if he genuinely grew to appreciate and prefer their more elaborate lifestyle. Was he a conqueror who understood diplomacy, or was he a man who simply had a taste for the finer things in life? The truth is likely a combination of both. The banquets were often a long affair, lasting for hours. The food was served on a series of platters, each more elaborate than the last. You would see everything from roasted meats and savory stews to delicate pastries and exotic fruits. The meals were a sensory experience, a feast for both the eyes and the stomach. The air was filled with the sounds of music, the murmur of conversation, and the rich smells of the food. You are handed a small, exquisite piece of a cake, a sweet confection made from honey and nuts. It is a taste of a luxury you have not experienced in a long time. You are reminded that the great deeds of history are not just the acts of a single man, but the culmination of the work of countless, often nameless, people. The campaign, you realize, is not just a story of conquest. It is a story of a long and difficult journey, and the small, simple comforts that sustain you along the way. The banquets, you now understand, were a quiet, powerful form of conquest, a way to win over hearts and minds without ever drawing a sword. You've navigated the tricky social waters of a Persian banquet, but now let's talk about the best part of any meal. In the ancient world, and just as today, there was a time for dessert, a moment to end a meal on a sweet, delicious note. This is the story of the sweet side of conquest, the sugary treats and confections that were a part of the feasts of Alexander and his officers. Your mainstream historical fact for this section is that the ancient world lacked refined sugar, which was a product of a later age. Instead, their desserts were made from natural sweeteners like honey and grape must, a kind of thick, sweet syrup made from boiling down grape juice. These were often combined with nuts, dried fruits, and cheeses to create a variety of confections. The desserts were not as sugary as ours today. They had a more subtle, natural sweetness that was a welcome end to a rich, savoury meal. Here's your quirky tidbit. There's a story among the scholars that Alexander's favourite dessert was a simple confection of honey, sesame seeds, and nuts. He reportedly loved the crunchy texture and the subtle sweetness. This anecdote, while possibly a fabrication, highlights the fact that even a king with all the world's wealth at his fingertips could find joy in a simple, humble treat. It's a reminder that a taste for the simple things is often a mark of a great man. As you are served a small, sweet pastry, you overhear a debate among the Persian and Macedonian officers. The Macedonian desserts are too simple, the Persian says. They lack the refinement of ours. The Macedonian replies, your desserts are too sweet. Historians still argue whether the Persian and Macedonian desserts were fundamentally different in their approach to sweetness, or if they were simply different cultural expressions of the same ingredients. Was it a matter of taste, or a matter of tradition? The truth is likely a combination of both. The desserts were often a key part of the social ritual of a banquet. After the main dishes had been cleared, the sweet course would be served, and the conversation would often become more relaxed and personal. It was a time for storytelling, for poetry, and for quiet conversation. The desserts, in this context, were not just a food, they were a social lubricant, a way to end a meal on a high note and to create a sense of camaraderie among the diners. You hold a small, golden piece of baklava, a sweet pastry made from layers of thin dough, nuts, and honey. The taste is a revelation, a perfect blend of sweet, nutty, and savoury. You are reminded that the great deeds of history are not just the acts of a single man, but the culmination of the work of countless, often nameless, people. The campaign, you realize, is not just a story of conquest. It is a story of a long and difficult journey, and the small, simple comforts that sustain you along the way. The desserts, you now understand, were a quiet, powerful form of conquest, a way to win over hearts and minds without ever drawing a sword. You've had a taste of the royal life and the lavish feasts of Persia, but the reality for a marching army is often less about organized banquets and more about necessity. This is the story of how an army's food source could shift from a predictable, supply line-based system to one of improvisation, foraging, and, in some cases, raiding. Your mainstream historical fact for this section is that while Alexander's supply chain was a marvel of ancient logistics, it was not always perfect. When the army moved faster than its baggage train, or when they passed through hostile or barren territory, the soldiers had to rely on a different kind of food source. This meant that the men had to become more self-sufficient, relying on their own skills and knowledge to find food. This was a high-stakes scavenger hunt, where a man's life could depend on his ability to find a patch of wild onions or a small stream with fish. Here's your quirky tidbit. There's a story among the men about a soldier who, in a moment of extreme hunger, tried to raid a local village for food. He was, of course, a little too enthusiastic, and he was caught by a group of angry farmers. The story goes that he was so embarrassed that he had to be rescued by his fellow soldiers, and he was the butt of jokes for weeks. The story highlights the fact that raiding was not always a simple or glamorous affair, and it often came with its own set of risks and consequences. As you chew on a tough piece of dried meat, you overhear a debate among the officers. This is what separates the true soldiers from the boys, one says. A true soldier can live off the land. He does not need a supply wagon to feed him, another replies. A true general provides for his men. A man who relies on his men to forage for food is a bad general. This is our scholarly debate for the night. Historians still argue whether Alexander's army's reliance on foraging and raiding was a sign of a flaw in his logistical planning, or if it was a deliberate part of his strategy. Was he a genius who understood that a self-sufficient army was a more mobile army? Or was he just a man who was forced to adapt to a reality that was beyond his control? The truth is likely a combination of both. The line between foraging and raiding was often a blurry one. A group of men sent to forage for wild plants and animals might find themselves in a situation where they had to take food from a local village, either by force or by coercion. This was a dangerous game, as it could turn a local population that was otherwise neutral into a hostile one. Alexander and his officers were aware of this, and they tried to keep the raiding to a minimum, but in the heat of a campaign, it was often a necessary evil. You find a patch of wild garlic and pull up a few bulbs. The smell is strong and clean, a welcome contrast to the dust and sweat. You tuck the bulbs into your ration bag, a small treasure to add to your next meal. You are reminded that the great deeds of history are not just the acts of a single man, but the culmination of the work of countless, often nameless, people, and the simple but powerful foods that sustained them. The campaign, you realize, is not just a story of conquest. It is a story of a long and difficult journey, and the unglamorous, but essential, work of keeping a great army fed. The foraging and raiding, you now understand, were a quiet, constant battle, one that had to be won every single day. You've had a taste of the raw, unpredictable nature of foraging and raiding, but what about when there was a surplus of food? How did Alexander's army ensure that a successful hunt or a bountiful harvest didn't go to waste? This is the story of ancient food preservation, with a focus on how they kept meat and fish from spoiling on a long and difficult campaign. Your mainstream historical fact for this section is that the most common and effective ways to preserve meat and fish in the ancient world were salting and drying. Salt was a precious commodity, but it was absolutely essential for a long campaign. Meat would be cut into strips, rubbed with a thick layer of salt, and then left to dry in the sun. This process would draw out the moisture, making it difficult for bacteria to grow. The resulting product was tough, incredibly salty, and almost inedible on its own, but it could be rehydrated and cooked in a stew, providing a vital source of protein on the march. Here's your quirky tidbit. There's a story among the soldiers about a group of men who, in an attempt to make their dried meat more palatable, tried to soak it in wine. The result was a bizarre, rubbery, and incredibly salty concoction that was so unappealing that the men were forced to throw it away. The story, while likely a fable, highlights the fact that food preservation was a science in itself, and a mistake could mean the loss of a vital food source. It was a reminder that even the simplest of tasks required skill and knowledge. As you chew on a tough, salty piece of dried meat, you overhear a debate among the cooks. The smoke gives it a good flavour, one says. It keeps the flies away and makes it last longer, another replies. The salt is a gift from the gods. Historians still argue whether salting or smoking was a more effective method of preservation in the ancient world. Was it a matter of regional preference, with some cultures preferring one method over the other? Or was it a matter of what was most practical in a given environment? The truth is likely a combination of both. Beyond just salting and drying, the army also used other, more localized methods. In colder climates, they might use the cold to their advantage, burying meat in the snow to keep it from spoiling. In a pinch, they might even resort to using a kind of ancient pickling process, using vinegar to preserve meat and fish. These methods were not as common as salting and drying, but they were a testament to the ingenuity of a people who were forced to adapt to a changing reality. You hold a small, tough piece of dried meat in your hands. It is a symbol of a long history, a food that has sustained shepherds, farmers, and soldiers for thousands of years. You are reminded that the great deeds of history are not just the acts of a single man, but the culmination of the work of countless, often nameless, people, and the simple but powerful foods that sustained them. The campaign, you realize, is not just a story of conquest. It is a story of a long and difficult journey, and the unglamorous, but essential, work of keeping a great army fed. The salted meat, you now understand, was a quiet, constant battle, one that had to be won every single day. You've learned that the army's diet, once defined by the simple foods of Macedon, was now being transformed by the new and exotic ingredients of the East. This is a story we touched on before, but now we'll go deeper, focusing on the powerful and aromatic spices that were more than just a culinary addition. They were a symbol of the wealth and diversity of the new empire. Your mainstream historical fact for this section is that the use of spices like cumin, coriander, and cinnamon in the ancient world was a mark of luxury and sophistication. For a long time, these spices were only available to the wealthy elite of the Mediterranean, who would acquire them through a complex network of traders and merchants. But as Alexander's army moved east, they were now in the lands where these spices grew naturally. For the common soldier, This was a culinary revolution, a new world of flavor that was a welcome escape from the monotony of the standard rations. Here's your quirky tidbit. There's a story among the cooks about a soldier who, in a moment of curiosity, tried to eat a whole cinnamon stick. He was, of course, unsuccessful. As the stick was tough and woody, the other men joked that he was a cinnamon barbarian, a person who didn't know how to appreciate the delicate flavor of the spice. The story, while likely a fable, highlights the fact that the men were not used to the raw form of these spices and had to learn how to use them. It was a learning process, a culinary education that happened one meal at a time. As you crush a few cumin seeds between your fingers, you overhear a debate among the cooks. These new spices are powerful, one says. A little goes a long way. Another replies, but they are a taste of victory. Historians still argue whether the culinary exchange was a one-way street, with the Macedonians adopting local flavors, or if they also introduced their own cooking methods and ingredients, creating a fusion cuisine. Did the locals start using olive oil, or did the Greeks and Macedonians begin to use ghee? The truth is likely that both sides influenced each other, creating a unique culinary blend that would continue long after Alexander's time. The spices were used in a variety of ways. They would be ground into a powder and added to stews and porridges, giving them a warm and earthy flavor. They would be used to marinate meats and vegetables, giving them a rich and complex taste. And they would be used in a variety of medicinal concoctions, as they were believed to have a variety of health benefits. For a soldier, a pinch of spice in his food wasn't just about flavor, it was about staying healthy. You hold a small, fragrant handful of spices in your hand. They are a tangible link to a world of a long history, a world of trade and exploration, of a new world. You are reminded that the great deeds of history are not just the acts of a single man, but the culmination of the work of countless, often nameless, people, and the simple, but powerful, things that sustained them. The campaign, you realize, is not just a story of conquest. It is a story of a long and difficult journey, and the unglamorous, but essential, work of keeping a great army fed. The spices, you now understand, were a quiet, powerful form of conquest, a way to win over hearts and minds without ever drawing a sword. You've had a taste of the new spices of the East. But let's go back to the most fundamental part of the army's diet, vegetables. In a world without canned or frozen produce, a soldier's diet was a constant reflection of the seasons and the local climate. This is the story of the vegetables in the ancient diet, the simple but vital greens and roots that sustained an army on the move. Your mainstream historical fact for this section is that the ancient Greeks and Macedonians ate a wide variety of vegetables. Think of foods like leeks, onions, garlic, cabbage, and various types of gourds. These were often a more reliable source of vitamins and minerals than fruits, as they could be grown in a wider variety of climates and were less prone to spoilage. For a soldier, a handful of leeks or a small onion could be a welcome addition to a stew. Adding both flavor and nutrition, they were a vital part of a balanced diet, a counterbalance to the heavy, carbohydrate-rich grains. Here's your quirky tidbit. There's a story among the medics that a new recruit, unfamiliar with the diet of the campaign, once tried to eat a raw turnip he had found in a field. He was, of course, unsuccessful, as the turnip was too tough and woody. The other men joked that he was a turnip barbarian, a person who didn't know how to appreciate the finer points of a cooked vegetable. The story, while likely a fable, highlights the fact that the men were not used to the raw form of these vegetables and had to learn how to prepare them. It was a learning process, a culinary education that happened one meal at a time. As you sit by a small fire, cooking a few wild leeks, you overhear a debate among the cooks. The cabbage is the best, one says. It keeps a long time and is easy to cook. Another replies, the onions are a gift from the gods. Historians still argue whether the prevalence of certain vegetables in the ancient diet was a matter of practical availability or a deep-seated cultural preference. Was a food like cabbage a staple because it was easy to grow and store, or was it a choice because it was a part of their culinary tradition? The truth is likely a combination of both. The vegetables were often prepared in a very simple way. They would be boiled in a pot, sometimes with a little oil or salt, and then eaten as a side dish or added to a stew. They were a versatile ingredient, a way to add both flavor and nutrition to a simple meal. For a soldier, A bowl of hot vegetable stew was a comfort, a taste of a home he had left behind. You hold a small, warm bowl of vegetable stew in your hands. The smell is earthy and comforting, a reminder of the simple but powerful foods that are fueling this incredible journey. You take a bite, and the taste is a burst of flavor that you have not experienced in a long time. You are reminded that the great deeds of history are not just the acts of a single man, but the culmination of the work of countless, often nameless, people, and the simple but powerful foods that sustained them. The campaign, you realize, is not just a story of conquest. It is a story of a long and difficult journey, and the unglamorous, but essential, work of keeping a great army fed. The vegetables, you now understand, were a quiet, powerful form of conquest, a way to win over hearts and minds without ever drawing a sword. You've had a taste of the vegetables that sustained Alexander's army. But you've also seen how the landscape changed with every passing mile. This is the story of how geography shaped the army's diet, a story of how the land itself, from the arid plains of Persia to the lush valleys of India, determined what a soldier ate and when. Your mainstream historical fact for this section is that Alexander's campaigns were a logistical nightmare, and a huge part of that was the vast and varied geography he had to contend with. The diet of the army was a constant reflection of where they were. In the arid, open lands of the Middle East, their diet was based on what could be easily transported and stored: dried grains, salted meat, and hard cheese. But when they reached the fertile river valleys, like the Indus and the Nile, their diet became more varied, with fresh fruits, vegetables, and fish. The land was not just a battlefield, it was a larder. Here's your quirky tidbit. There's a story among the men about a time they were marching through a particularly barren, mountainous region. A soldier, in a moment of desperation, tried to eat a type of wild moss he had found on a rock. He was, of course, unsuccessful, as the moss was tough and inedible. The other men joked that he was a moss-eater, a person who didn't know how to appreciate the finer points of a foraging. The story, while likely a fable, highlights the fact that the men were constantly adapting to a changing reality, and sometimes that reality was a very hungry one. As you chew on a tough piece of dried meat, a food that was a product of a dry, arid climate, you overhear a debate among the officers. "We should have stayed in the fertile lands," one says. "A man cannot fight on an empty stomach." Another replies, "A true conqueror takes the good with the bad." Historians still argue whether Alexander's logistical decisions were always driven by a desire for territorial expansion, or if they were sometimes influenced by practical needs, like access to reliable food sources. Did he conquer the coastal cities for their ports and trade, or for their abundant fishing grounds? The answer is likely both. A blend of military strategy and logistical necessity. The variety of the army's diet was a direct result of the variety of the lands they conquered. In the mountains, they would eat wild game and nuts. In the coastal regions, they would eat fish and seafood. And in the fertile plains, they would eat a wide variety of grains, fruits, and vegetables. The army was a culinary chameleon, constantly adapting its diet to its surroundings. This was a testament to the resourcefulness of the men and their leaders. You find a patch of wild thyme and crush a few of the leaves between your fingers. The scent is strong and clean, a stark contrast to the dust and sweat. You tuck the sprig into your ration bag, a small treasure to add to your next barley and lentil stew. This simple act is a quiet rebellion against the monotony, a way to add a bit of flavour and joy to a life that is otherwise filled with hardship. The foraged foods were more than just calories. They were a link to the land you were in, a tiny taste of the world you were conquering. They were a reminder that even in the midst of a grand and relentless war machine, a person still needed a taste of something fresh and alive. You've seen the grand scale of the army's diet, but now let's go small. Let's talk about the most personal part of a soldier's food supply, the one he carried on his person. This is the story of the humble pouch and rucksack, the small but vital mobile pantry of a man on the move. Your mainstream historical fact for this section is that a Roman legionary would carry a sarcina, a kind of personal pack with enough food for several days. While Alexander's army was not as standardized, a similar principle applied. Each soldier would carry a personal pouch or a small rucksack filled with the most vital of all foods, a small measure of grain, a piece of hard cheese, and a handful of dried fruit or nuts. This was a soldier's safety net, his last line of defense against hunger when the supply wagons were delayed or the foraging was bad. This small, personal stash was a testament to the discipline and foresight of the army. Here's your quirky tidbit. There's a story among the men about a soldier who, in a moment of extreme hunger, tried to raid his own personal rucksack. He was so desperate that he ate his emergency rations, and the other men joked that he had eaten his own life. The story, while likely a fable, highlights the importance of this personal stash. It was a sacred thing, a resource to be used only in the most dire of circumstances. It was a symbol of a man's ability to survive on his own, a quiet act of rebellion against the grand, often impersonal, machine of the army. As you reach into your small pouch, pulling out a piece of hard cheese, you overhear a debate among the soldiers. "My pouch is a testament to my foresight," one says. "I have enough food for 3 days," another replies. "A good soldier does not need a pouch, he can live off the land." This is our scholarly debate for the night. Historians still argue whether the personal food stash was a matter of a soldier's personal responsibility or if it was a mandated part of the army's logistical plan. Was it a sign of individual self-reliance or a clever way for the army to shift the burden of logistics to the men? The truth is likely a combination of both. The contents of the pouch were a direct reflection of a soldier's personal preference and the resources he could acquire. A soldier from a coastal city might have a small piece of salted fish. A soldier from a farming family might have a small bag of dried lentils. These small, personal stashes were a tangible link to a world a long way from the battlefield. They were a taste of home, a small comfort in a world of constant change. You hold a small piece of dried fruit in your hands. It is tough and chewy, and the sweetness is a burst of flavor that you have not experienced in a long time. You are reminded that the great deeds of history are not just the acts of a single man, but the culmination of the work of countless, often nameless, people, and the simple, but powerful, foods that sustained them. The campaign, you realize, is not just a story of conquest. It is a story of a long and difficult journey, and the unglamorous, but essential, work of keeping a great army fed. The humble pouch and rucksack, you now understand, were a quiet, powerful form of conquest, a way to win over hearts and minds without ever drawing a sword. You've seen the contents of the humble rucksack, but now let's talk about how the food inside it was prepared. This is the story of cooking over an open fire, the most fundamental and universal method of preparing food in the ancient world. For a soldier on the move, a fire wasn't just a source of warmth, it was a kitchen, a social center, and a symbol of civilization in a world of wilderness. Your mainstream historical fact for this section is that most ancient armies, including Alexander's, relied on simple, portable cooking methods. The most common was cooking over an open fire. This could be as simple as a small fire pit dug in the ground, with a few stones placed around it to support a pot. Or it could be a more elaborate affair, with a large communal fire where whole animals could be roasted on a spit. The method was simple, but it required skill and a deep understanding of the properties of fire and food. A good cook knew how to control the heat, how to use the smoke to flavor the food, and how to tell when a dish was done just by the smell. Here's your quirky tidbit. There's a story among the cooks about a soldier who, in a moment of extreme hunger, tried to cook a fish by burying it in the hot coals of a fire without wrapping it in mud or leaves. He was, of course, unsuccessful, as the fish was burned to a crisp on the outside and raw on the inside. The other men joked that he was a fire barbarian, a person who didn't know how to appreciate the finer points of a slow roast. The story, while likely a fable, highlights the fact that even a simple task like cooking over a fire required a certain level of knowledge and skill. As you sit by a small fire, watching a pot of stew simmer, you overhear a debate among the cooks. "The stew is a sign of a good camp," one says. "It shows that we have time to cook and that we are not running," another replies. "The roasted meat is a sign of victory." Historians still argue whether the cooking methods of the army were a matter of practical necessity or a cultural preference. Was the prevalence of stews a sign of a mobile army that needed to cook quickly, or was it a choice because it was a part of their culinary tradition? The truth is likely a combination of both. The open fire was more than just a place to cook. It was a social centre, a place where men would gather at the end of a long day to share stories, to laugh, and to forget, for a time, the dangers of the campaign, the crackling of the fire, the smell of the food, and the camaraderie of the men all combined to create a sense of peace and belonging. It was a brief escape from the reality of the war. You hold a small, warm bowl of stew in your hands. The smell is earthy and comforting, a reminder of the simple but powerful foods that are fueling this incredible journey. You take a bite, and the taste is a burst of flavour that you have not experienced in a long time. You are reminded that the great deeds of history are not just the acts of a single man, but the culmination of the work of countless, often nameless, people, and the simple but powerful things that sustained them. The open fire, you now understand, was a quiet, powerful form of conquest, a way to win over hearts and minds without ever drawing a sword. You've seen the simple meals of the Macedonian army, but what about the enemy? You are no longer just a soldier, you are now a privileged guest, a fly on the wall at a feast hosted by Darius III, Alexander's greatest rival. This is the story of a culinary contrast, a moment that highlights the vast difference between the two cultures and their leaders. Your mainstream historical fact for this section is that the Persian Achaemenid Empire was known for its lavish and luxurious lifestyle, and their banquets were legendary. Unlike the relatively Spartan dining habits of the Macedonians, the Persians revelled in excess. The food was a work of art, with exotic spices, rare fruits, and a variety of meats and confections that were a far cry from the simple fare of a marching army. The banquets were a way for the Persian kings to project their wealth and power, a show of force that was as effective as any army. Here's your quirky tidbit. There's a story among the scholars that Darius III had a personal cook who was so skilled that he could make a roasted peacock look as if it were still alive, with all its feathers intact. The story, while likely an exaggeration, highlights the Persian obsession with presentation and the idea that food should be a feast for the eyes as well as the stomach. It was a world where a simple meal was a complex work of art, a reflection of the empire's wealth and sophistication. As you recline on a silk cushion, surrounded by opulence, you overhear a debate among the Persian nobles. "Our king knows how to live," one says. "He does not eat like a common soldier." Another replies, "He eats like a king." Historians still argue whether the Persian love of luxury was a sign of a decadent and weakening empire, or if it was a deliberate strategy to show off their power and intimidate their rivals. Was the excess a sign of a culture in decline, or was it a powerful form of political theatre? The truth is likely a combination of both. The banquet is a sensory overload. The air is thick with the scent of rosewater, saffron, and cinnamon. Platters of roasted gazelle, spiced chicken, and sweet pastries are brought out in a seemingly endless procession. The wine, a rich, dark, and undiluted vintage, flows freely. The Persians, unlike the Macedonians, did not believe in watering down their wine. It was a symbol of their power and their ability to consume the best of everything. You are handed a small, exquisite piece of a cake, a sweet confection made from layers of thin dough, nuts, and honey. The taste is a revelation, a perfect blend of sweet, nutty, and savoury. You are reminded that the great deeds of history are not just the acts of a single man, but the culmination of the work of countless, often nameless, people. The campaign, you realize, is not just a story of conquest, it is a story of a long and difficult journey, and the small, simple comforts that sustain you along the way. The contrast between the simple meals of Alexander's army and the lavish feasts of Darius III, you now understand, was a quiet, powerful form of conquest, a way to win over hearts and minds without ever drawing a sword. You've now seen the stark contrast between the humble fare of Alexander's army and the lavish banquets of his rival, Darius III. But as the campaign continues its relentless push eastward, the geography and culture continue to shift. Your journey now takes you to the far-off lands of Central Asia, to the shores of the Oxus River. This is the story of the unique foods found in a land that was both beautiful and unforgiving. Your mainstream historical fact for this section is that the people of Central Asia, particularly in what is now modern-day Uzbekistan and Turkmenistan, relied heavily on a diet of dairy, meat, and grains. The climate was too dry for the lush vegetable gardens of Persia, and the terrain was not conducive to the kind of agriculture found in Egypt. For a soldier, this meant a return to a more rugged, less varied diet. The food was hearty and designed for survival in a harsh, unforgiving landscape. You would see a lot of fermented milk products, a kind of ancient yogurt or cheese. That was a key part of the local diet. Here's your quirky tidbit. There's a story among the men about a soldier who, in a moment of extreme thirst, tried to drink from a local stream. He was, of course, unsuccessful, as the water was too salty. The locals, in a moment of generosity, gave him a drink of fermented mare's milk, a drink that was a staple of the local nomadic tribes. The soldier, unused to the taste, was reportedly so shocked that he spat it out. The story, while likely a fable, highlights the fact that the men were constantly encountering new and sometimes bizarre foods that were a part of the local culture, as you chew on a tough piece of dried meat, a food that was a product of the dry, arid climate. You overhear a debate among the officers. This land is a difficult one says. It does not provide for a man as easily as the lands of Egypt. Another replies, a true conqueror learns to live off the land, no matter what it provides. This land will make us stronger. This is our scholarly debate for the night. Historians still argue whether Alexander's push into Central Asia was a brilliant strategic move to secure his northern flank, or if it was a costly mistake that put his army in a difficult and unforgiving environment. Was it a calculated risk or a moment of hubris? The truth is likely a combination of both. The food of Central Asia was a reflection of the nomadic lifestyle of the people who lived there. They relied on their animals for everything: meat, milk, and cheese. The food was often prepared in a very simple way, over an open fire, and it was designed to be portable and long-lasting. You would see a lot of dried meat, a kind of jerky, and a lot of hard, salty cheese. This was a diet that was built for a life on the move, a life that was a constant test of survival. You find a small, hard piece of cheese in your ration bag. It is salty and tangy, a taste of a life a long way from home. You are reminded that the great deeds of history are not just the acts of a single man, but the culmination of the work of countless, often nameless, people, and the simple but powerful foods that sustained them. The campaign, you realize, is not just a story of conquest. It is a story of a long and difficult journey, and the unglamorous, but essential, work of keeping a great army fed. The food of the Oxus River, you now understand, was a quiet, powerful form of conquest, a way to win over hearts and minds without ever drawing a sword. You've had a taste of the harshness of Central Asia, and you've seen how the land can shape an army's diet. Now, your journey brings you to a point of no return, a place that marked the end of Alexander's grand expedition. This is the story of the Hyphasis River and the logistical limits of a campaign that had gone on for far too long. The food, once a source of comfort and strength, now becomes a symbol of the army's exhaustion and a reason for their rebellion. Your mainstream historical fact for this section is that the Hyphasis River, in modern-day India, marked the furthest point of Alexander's conquests. The army, after years of continuous marching and fighting, was exhausted and demoralized. The constant push eastward, the endless battles, and the ever-present threat of hunger had worn them down. Their food, once a source of strength, was now a constant source of anxiety. The supply lines were stretched to their absolute breaking point, and the men knew that to go further would mean to risk starvation. Here's your quirky tidbit. There's a story among the men that one of the officers, in a desperate attempt to persuade the men to continue, tried to make a new meal with a local wild plant he had found. The men, of course, were so tired of new and strange foods that they refused to eat it. The story, while likely a fable, highlights the fact that the men were not just hungry, they were also suffering from a kind of culinary fatigue. They wanted the simple, familiar foods of home, not a new and unknown food from a new and unknown land. As you stand on the banks of the river, watching the men and officers in a heated debate, you overhear a conversation. "Our stomachs are empty," one soldier cries. "We cannot go on." Another replies, "A true soldier fights on his will, not on his stomach." This is our scholarly debate for the night. Historians still argue whether the army's refusal to continue was a matter of a logistical crisis or a crisis of morale. Were they truly on the verge of starvation? Or was the food crisis a convenient excuse to end a campaign they no longer had the heart for? The truth is likely a combination of both. The lack of food was a tangible sign of a spiritual and emotional exhaustion that had been building for years. The food, or lack thereof, became a powerful symbol. The men who had been a part of this grand expedition for so long knew that the promise of more food in the east was just a dream. They had seen the supply lines break down before, and they were not willing to risk their lives for a king who seemed to have no limit to his ambition. The lack of food was a tangible sign of a journey that had gone on for too long, a journey that had lost its way. You hold a small, hard piece of barley bread in your hand. It is tough and unappetizing, a stark contrast to the lavish feasts you once saw. You are reminded that the great deeds of history are not just the acts of a single man, but the culmination of the work of countless, often nameless, people, and the simple, but powerful, foods that sustained them. The campaign, you realize, is not just a story of conquest. It is a story of a long and difficult journey, and the unglamorous, but essential, work of keeping a great army fed. The food crisis at the Hyphasis River, you now understand, was a quiet, powerful form of conquest. A way to win over hearts and minds without ever drawing a sword. The army has made its decision. The Hyphasis River is the end of the line. The journey back is just as difficult as the journey forward, and the constant threat of hunger remains. This is the story of the great army's hunger, the moments of scarcity and even famine that a grand campaign can inflict upon an otherwise unstoppable force. Your mainstream historical fact for this section is that while Alexander's campaign is often remembered for its grand battles and lavish feasts, it was also a story of constant, low-grade hunger. An army of tens of thousands of men, plus their animals and support staff, required a truly staggering amount of food, and the supply lines were never a perfect system. A delayed shipment, a bad harvest, or a hostile local population could mean the difference between a full belly and a hungry one. The men lived with a constant awareness of this reality, and it was a source of great anxiety. Here's your quirky tidbit. There's a story among the soldiers about a time they were so hungry that they tried to eat the leather of their own sandals. They boiled the leather for hours, but it was, of course, inedible. The men joked that they were a leather army, a group of men who were so desperate that they would eat anything. The story, while likely a fable, highlights the fact that the men were often pushed to their absolute limit. It was a reminder that even the strongest and most disciplined army could be brought to its knees by the simple, brutal reality of hunger, as you chew on a tough piece of dried meat, a food that was a product of a dry, arid climate. You overhear a debate among the officers. "We must push forward to find food," one says. "A hungry army is a dangerous army," another replies. "A starving army is a dead army." Historians still argue whether Alexander's leadership style was a form of genius or a form of reckless hubris. Did he push his men because he knew they were capable, or did he push them because he was too ambitious to stop? The truth is likely a combination of both. The moments of scarcity were not just a matter of an empty stomach, they were a moral and psychological blow. A hungry army is a mutinous army. It is an army that loses its discipline, its cohesion, and its will to fight. Alexander knew this, and he would often try to keep his men well fed. But even a king with all the world's wealth at his fingertips could not always control the forces of nature and the chaos of war. You hold a small, hard piece of barley bread in your hand. It is tough and unappetizing, a stark contrast to the lavish feasts you once saw. You are reminded that the great deeds of history are not just the acts of a single man, but the culmination of the work of countless, often nameless, people, and the simple, but powerful, foods that sustained them. The campaign, that you realize, is not just a story of conquest, it is a story of a long and difficult journey, and the unglamorous, but essential, work of keeping a great army fed. The hunger of the army, you now understand, was a quiet, powerful form of conquest, a way to win over hearts and minds without ever drawing a sword. You've seen the hunger of the army, but you've also seen the other side of the coin, the feasts. This is the story of how Alexander used food not just as sustenance, but as a symbol of power and generosity. He understood that a king who provided for his men and who shared his bounty with them was a king who would be loved and feared in equal measure. Your mainstream historical fact for this section is that throughout his campaign, Alexander would often host grand feasts to celebrate victories, to honor his men, and to cement his authority over his new subjects. These feasts were more than just a party. They were a political statement. The sheer quantity and quality of the food and drink were a powerful demonstration of his wealth and his ability to command resources from across a vast and diverse empire. The food, in his hands, was a form of political currency, a way to show his power without ever drawing a sword. Here's your quirky tidbit. There's a story among the scholars that at one such feast, Alexander had his cooks prepare a dish with a single, rare spice that was worth its weight in gold. The dish was served to his most loyal commanders, a quiet and subtle way of showing his favor. The story, while likely a fable, highlights the fact that Alexander was a master of political theater, and he used every tool at his disposal, including food, to cement his authority and to maintain the loyalty of his men. As you stand on the edge of a massive banquet hall, watching the revelry unfold, you overhear a debate among the Persian officials. "He honors us with this feast," one says. "He is not like the other conquerors," another, more cynical, replies. "He feeds us his bread so that we will swallow his rule." This is our scholarly debate for the night. Historians still argue whether Alexander's feasting was a genuine expression of his desire for a blended empire or a clever political ploy to disarm his new subjects. Was he a true believer in a Hellenic-Persian fusion, or was he a shrewd politician who understood that a full belly and a good glass of wine could make a conquered people more compliant? The truth is likely a combination of both. The feasts were also a way for Alexander to reward his men. He would hold great banquets to celebrate victories, and he would shower his men with gifts and praise. These feasts were a way to maintain the loyalty of his army, to show them that their sacrifices were not in vain. The food, in this context, was a symbol of reward, a tangible sign of their success. The act of dining with their king was an honor that reinforced their dedication to him. You are handed a small piece of a roasted bird, glazed with a sweet sauce. It is a taste of a luxury you have not experienced in a long time. You are reminded that the great deeds of history are not just the acts of a single man, but the culmination of the work of countless, often nameless, people. The campaign, you realize, is not just a story of conquest. It is a story of a long and difficult journey, and the small, simple comforts that sustain you along the way. The feasts, you now understand, were a quiet, powerful form of conquest, a way to win over hearts and minds without ever drawing a sword. You've seen the front line of Alexander's army. But what about the invisible army behind it? This is the story of the unseen kitchen staff, the massive, often overlooked logistical team that made the entire campaign possible. These were the men and women who, day in and day out, toiled to turn raw ingredients into a meal for tens of thousands of hungry soldiers. Your mainstream historical fact for this section is that the success of a military campaign in the ancient world was just as dependent on its logistical tail as it was on its fighting head. For every 10 soldiers, there was at least one person in the support staff, and a significant portion of these were dedicated to food. There were millers to grind the grain, bakers to bake the bread, butchers to prepare the meat, and cooks to turn all of it into a meal. They were a well-oiled machine, a testament to the organizational genius of Alexander's army. Here's your quirky tidbit. There's a story among the cooks that Alexander, in a moment of frustration, once tried to bake his own bread. He was, of course, unsuccessful, as the dough was too tough and the oven was too hot. The cooks, in a moment of ancient sass, joked that he was better at conquering the world than he was at making a simple loaf of bread. The story, while likely a fabrication, highlights the fact that even a king with all the world's power at his fingertips was still dependent on the skills of his cooks. As you stand on the edge of a massive field kitchen, watching the cooks at work, you overhear a debate among them. The secret to a good meal is the ingredients. One says, "A good miller and a good butcher are worth their weight in gold." Another replies, "Nonsense. A good cook can make anything taste good." This is our scholarly debate for the night. Historians still argue whether the culinary skills of the ancient world were a matter of raw ingredients or the skill of the cook. Was a good meal a product of a rich land, or was it a product of a master chef? The truth is likely a combination of both. The work of the kitchen staff was a long and difficult one. They would rise before dawn to prepare for the day's march, and they would often be the last to sleep. After all the men had been fed, they had to be resourceful, often using whatever they could find in the local area to supplement their rations. They were the unsung heroes of the campaign, the people who made sure that the fighting men were well fed and ready for battle. You watch as a baker, his hands covered in flour, pulls a hot loaf of bread from a clay oven. The smell is a powerful reminder of the simple, but powerful, foods that are fueling this incredible journey. You are reminded that the great deeds of history are not just the acts of a single man, but the culmination of the work of countless, often nameless, people. The campaign, you realize, is not just a story of conquest. It is a story of a long and difficult journey, and the unglamorous, but essential, work of keeping a great army fed. The unseen kitchen staff, you now understand, were a quiet, powerful form of conquest, a way to win over hearts and minds without ever drawing a sword. You've seen the hard work of the kitchen staff, but now let's talk about the drink of kings. This is a topic we touched on before, but now we'll go deeper, focusing on the different qualities and styles of wine that were available to Alexander and his inner circle. Wine was more than just a beverage. It was a symbol of wealth, status, and power. Your mainstream historical fact for this section is that the quality of wine in the ancient world varied greatly, just as it does today. The best wines came from specific regions, like the islands of Chios and Lesbos, and they were often aged for years in large clay amphorae. These were the wines that were reserved for the wealthy elite and for special occasions. The common wine, however, was a much simpler affair, a product of local grapes that was often consumed young and was a staple of the common person's diet. For a king, the choice of wine was a deliberate one, a way to show his taste and his wealth. Here's your quirky tidbit. There's a story among the scholars that Alexander's favourite wine was a specific vintage from the island of Lesbos. He reportedly loved its sweet, almost honey-like flavour. The story, while likely a fabrication, highlights the fact that Alexander was a man of refined taste, and he appreciated the finer things in life. It's a reminder that even a king with all the world's power at his fingertips could find joy in a simple, humble glass of wine. As you sip a small glass of a dark, rich wine, you overhear a debate among the officers. The best wine is the one that is the most potent, one says. It is a wine for a man who is a true warrior. Another replies, the best wine is the one that is the most refined. It is a wine for a man who is a true king. This is our scholarly debate for the night. Historians still argue whether the Greek and Macedonian love of wine was a matter of a sophisticated palate or a desire for a powerful, inebriating drink. Was wine a social lubricant or a way to escape from the harsh reality of the campaign? The truth is likely a combination of both. The wine was often served in a large mixing bowl, a crater, where it was diluted with water. The act of mixing the wine was a social ritual, a way to create a communal drink that was both refreshing and a source of camaraderie. The wine was a way to relax at the end of a long day, to share stories and to forget, for a time, the dangers of the campaign. The choice of wine, and the way it was consumed, was a reflection of the social status of the drinker. You hold a small, golden glass of a rich, sweet wine in your hands. The smell is a complex bouquet of fruits and spices, a powerful contrast to the simple, watery wine of the common soldier. You are reminded that the great deeds of history are not just the acts of a single man, but the culmination of the work of countless, often nameless, people. The campaign, you realize, is not just a story of conquest. It is a story of a long and difficult journey, and the unglamorous, but essential, work of keeping a great army fed. The wine of kings, you now understand, was a quiet, powerful form of conquest, a way to win over hearts and minds without ever drawing a sword. You've had a taste of the wine of kings, but our story is nearing its end. The army has returned to Babylon, the heart of Alexander's new empire. The long campaign is over, and the time for consolidation and celebration has begun. This is the story of the grand, final feasts of Alexander's life. a time when a king who had once been known for his simple tastes was now embracing the luxury and grandeur of his new role. Your mainstream historical fact for this section is that the final years of Alexander's life in Babylon were marked by a series of lavish banquets and parties. These were not just for celebration, they were a form of political theatre, a way for Alexander to show his power and to integrate his new empire. He would host massive feasts for his commanders, his new Persian allies, and for a variety of foreign dignitaries. The food was a mix of Persian and Macedonian cuisine, a testament to his desire for a blended empire. The feasts were a far cry from the simple meals of the campaign. They were a display of wealth, power, and a kind of reckless ambition that would soon consume him. Here's your quirky tidbit. There's a story among the scholars that at one such feast, Alexander had his cooks prepare a dish with a single, rare spice that was worth its weight in gold. The dish was served to his most loyal commanders, a quiet and subtle way of showing his favour. The story, while likely a fabrication, highlights the fact that Alexander was a master of political theatre, and he used every tool at his disposal, including food, to cement his authority and to maintain the loyalty of his men. As you stand on the edge of a massive banquet hall, watching the revelry unfold, you overhear a debate among the Persian officials. "He honours us with this feast," one says. "He is not like the other conquerors." Another, more cynical, replies, "He feeds us his bread so that we will swallow his rule." This is our scholarly debate for the night. Historians still argue whether Alexander's feasting was a genuine expression of his desire for a blended empire or a clever political ploy to disarm his new subjects. Was he a true believer in a Hellenic-Persian fusion, or was he a shrewd politician who understood that a full belly and a good glass of wine could make a conquered people more compliant? The truth is likely a combination of both. The banquets were often a long affair, lasting for hours. The food was served on a series of platters, each more elaborate than the last. You would see everything from roasted meats and savoury stews to delicate pastries and exotic fruits. The meals were a sensory experience, a feast for both the eyes and the stomach. The air was filled with the sounds of music, the murmur of conversation, and the rich smells of the food. You are handed a small piece of a roasted bird, glazed with a sweet sauce. It is a taste of a luxury you have not experienced in a long time. You are reminded that the great deeds of history are not just the acts of a single man, but the culmination of the work of countless, often nameless, people. The campaign, you realize, is not just a story of conquest, it is a story of a long and difficult journey, and the small, simple comforts that sustain you along the way. The feasts, you now understand, were a quiet, powerful form of conquest, a way to win over hearts and minds without ever drawing a sword. The final feast has ended, but our story is not yet over. Now, the final chapter is upon us. This is the story of Alexander's last meals, a quiet, almost heartbreaking look at the diet of a dying man. This is a story that, while sad, can tell us a great deal about the final days of one of history's greatest conquerors. Your mainstream historical fact for this section is that the final days of Alexander's life were a mystery, and his death has been a source of speculation for thousands of years, but we do know, from ancient accounts, that his final days were marked by a long, lingering illness. During this time, his diet would have shifted from the lavish feasts of Babylon to something much simpler. His food would have been light, easy to digest, and likely prepared with an eye toward medicine, not flavour. He would have likely been given broths, thin gruels, and simple bread. A stark contrast to the roasted boar and spiced wines of his prime. Here's your quirky tidbit. There's a story among the scholars that Alexander, in his final days, was so weak that he was only able to drink a small amount of watered-down wine. He reportedly asked for a drink of a certain kind of wine, a sweet and simple vintage from his home of Macedon. The story, while likely a fabrication, highlights the fact that in his final days, Alexander was looking for comfort and a connection to a world he had left behind. He was a man who, at the end of his life, was not a conqueror, but a son of Macedon. As you stand in the antechamber of Alexander's sick room, you overhear a debate among his physicians. "We must give him more hot foods," one says. "They will restore his humours," another replies. "No, his body is hot with fever." This is our scholarly debate for the night. Historians still argue whether Alexander's death was a result of his illness, a poisoned cup, or a combination of both. Did his diet, or the lack thereof, contribute to his death? The truth is that we will never know for sure, but the accounts of his final meals, or the lack of them, tell us a great deal about his final days. The final meals were not a celebration, they were a sad and quiet affair. The food, in this context, was not a symbol of power or wealth. It was a symbol of a life that was slowly fading away. It was a reminder that even the greatest of men, in the end, are just human. The broths, the gruels, the simple bread, were a powerful and poignant reminder of the fragility of life. You are handed a small, empty cup. It is a symbol of a life that is over, a life that has been a long and difficult journey. You are reminded that the great deeds of history are not just the acts of a single man, but the culmination of the work of countless, often nameless, people. The campaign, you realize, is not just a story of conquest, it is a story of a long and difficult journey, and the small, simple comforts that sustain you along the way. The diet of a dying man, you now understand, was a quiet, powerful form of conquest, a way to win over hearts and minds without ever drawing a sword. The king is gone, the empire is in disarray, but the culinary journey we have taken is not. This is the story of Alexander's lasting impact, not on the political map of the world, but on its culinary landscape. The food, you realize, is the most lasting legacy of all, a quiet echo that continues to shape our world today. Your mainstream historical fact for this section is that Alexander's conquests created a vast, interconnected network of trade and cultural exchange that would last for centuries. The spices of India, the fruits of Persia, and the grains of Egypt all flowed back to the Mediterranean world, forever changing its diet. The fusion of Greek, Persian, and Indian cooking methods and ingredients created a new and vibrant cuisine, a testament to the power of cultural exchange. The food we eat today, from the spices in our curry to the figs in our salads, all have a long and complicated history, a history that, in many ways, began with Alexander's campaigns. Here's your quirky tidbit. There's a story among the scholars that a soldier who returned from Alexander's campaign brought with him a single, small plant from the east, a plant that was said to have magical properties. The plant, of course, was a form of mint, a common herb today. But in the ancient world, it was a rare and exotic thing. The story, while likely a fable, highlights the fact that the men who returned from the campaign were not just soldiers, they were also ambassadors of a new and exciting world. They brought back with them not just tales of conquest, but also the seeds of a new culinary future. As you sit in a quiet garden, a long way from the dust and heat of the campaign, you overhear a debate among the philosophers. He conquered a vast empire, one says, but what is his legacy? Another replies, his legacy is not in the battles he won, but in the bridges he built. He brought the East and the West together, and in doing so, he created a new world. This is our scholarly debate for the night. Historians still argue whether Alexander's conquests were a deliberate act of cultural fusion or a happy accident of a grand military campaign. Was he a man who sought to create a new, blended world? Or was he just a man who was too ambitious to stop? The truth is likely a combination of both. The world that Alexander left behind was a different one. The food, the spices, and the cooking methods had all changed. The simple, almost austere, diet of the ancient Macedonians had been replaced by a new, more complex, and more vibrant cuisine. It was a cuisine that was a reflection of the empire itself, a mix of cultures, a blend of old and new, and a testament to the power of a long and difficult journey. You close your eyes and you can almost taste it. The roasted meats, the spiced stews, the sweet pastries, the bitter herbs, the salty cheese. It is a taste of a long history, a taste of a world that has been a long and difficult journey. You are reminded that the great deeds of history are not just the acts of a single man, but the culmination of the work of countless, often nameless, people, and the simple, but powerful, foods that sustained them. The campaign, you realize, is not just a story of conquest, it is a story of a long and difficult journey, and the unglamorous, but essential, work of keeping a great army fed. The food, you now understand, was a quiet, powerful form of conquest, a way to win over hearts and minds without ever drawing a sword. The sun is setting now, and the world is growing quiet. The journey we have taken together is coming to an end. The stories we have shared, the foods we have tasted, and the history we have explored have all led us to this moment. The world of Alexander is gone, but its echoes remain in the food we eat, in the stories we tell, and in the quiet moments we share. The history is here, right here, in the stillness of the night. It's time to rest now, to let your mind drift away. The world is quiet. The history is done. End of script. Sweet dreams.